Welcome, dear subscribers and curious listeners of my channel. Today we're taking a closer look at one of the most memorable, though far from the most competent, teachers at Hogwarts, Gilderoy Lockhart. In the film The Chamber of Secrets, he was portrayed by Kenneth Branagh, and while the character came to life brilliantly on screen, much of Lockhart's literary persona was left behind. I invite you to revisit what was cut or changed in the adaptation. Enjoy watching. Number 1. Voldemort's Curse. There's a reason why Defense Against the Dark Arts professors never last more than a year at Hogwarts. And it's not just Lockhart's incompetence or disastrous decisions. In the books, it's revealed that Voldemort once applied for this position. After Dumbledore turned him down, it's said that he cursed the job and no one could hold it for longer than a single school year. Now, the films barely mention this, but in the books, the curse explains the odd misfortunes that befell every new professor, Lockhart included. Number 2. His lessons. Lockhart's very first class made it clear what Hogwarts was dealing with. The Cornish pixies spun out of control, and the professor, unable to handle them, simply ran away. Hermione was the one who had to restore order. This scene is the only one shown in the film, but the book includes more lessons, each more useless than the last. In one class, Lockhart gave a quiz, 54 questions, all about himself. Hermione answered them all correctly, much to Ron's horror. Lockhart also loved reading passages from his own books aloud, which quickly wore down the students' patience. Number 3. Homework. If you thought Muggle school homework was bad, imagine being assigned a poem about your teacher's supposed heroic deeds. And the reward? A signed photo. That's right. No grade, no real academic value, just more self-worship from Lockhart. It raises a fair question: why did Dumbledore allow this kind of teaching? Surely he knew exactly what kind of man he had hired. Number 4. Valentine's Day. Lockhart turned the holiday into a full-blown circus. He decorated the Great Hall with pink ribbons, hearts, and even hired dwarves to deliver valentines throughout the school. To Harry's horror, he received a valentine from Ginny Weasley in front of everyone. Lockhart, however, was thrilled. He got 46 valentines that day, including one from Hermione. This moment was completely skipped in the film, though it would have said a lot about the professor's inflated ego. Number 5. Helping the Golden Trio. Sometimes foolishness can be useful. When Harry, Ron, and Hermione needed to brew Polyjuice Potion, they required a professor's permission to access the restricted section of the library. Naturally, they chose the most gullible, vain teacher, and it worked. Lockhart asked no questions and happily signed the note. This scene was left out of the film, but it was one of the few times when Lockhart's vanity actually worked in the trio's favor. Number 6. Hagrid couldn't stand him. Hagrid is someone who rarely speaks badly of his colleagues, but Lockhart was an exception. When Harry mentioned how often Lockhart boasted about his accomplishments, Hagrid snapped, "He's a phony and everyone knows it." This shocked Harry. If even gentle giant Hagrid couldn't tolerate the man, that said something. Lockhart, of course, was visibly irritated by the fact that Harry was more famous than he was, especially in the eyes of others. Number 7. Professor Sprout didn't like him either. Professor Pomona Sprout is a background character in the films but plays a more important role in the books. In Chamber of Secrets, she and Lockhart had a real conflict. He dared to claim he knew more about herbology than she did. After that, Sprout stopped hiding her feelings. What especially enraged her was the moment Lockhart pulled Harry out of her class and slammed the door right in her face. Her patience had clearly run out. Number 8. His admiration for Snape. Gilderoy Lockhart admired Severus Snape for all the wrong reasons. He didn't respect his mastery of potions or his sharp intellect. No, Lockhart believed Snape must be chasing the same thing he was, fame. "I do envy you, Severus," he once said, smiling at a staff meeting. "All those little cauldrons bubbling away in the dungeons. Plenty of time to write a book or two, I should think." Snape didn't answer. He simply narrowed his eyes. Lockhart was certain Snape shared his hunger for the spotlight. He often praised him in public, trying to flatter his way into camaraderie. "Severus has a flair for the dramatic, don't you think?" he told a group of students after their disastrous dueling club session. "That hair, that cloak, he knows how to make an entrance." Lockhart meant it as a compliment. Snape took it as mockery. His silence grew colder, his glares sharper. Snape, of course, had no interest in being liked, and even less in being liked by Lockhart. He saw through the polished smile and empty flattery. To him, Lockhart was a fraud and an insult to the profession. While Lockhart prattled on about their shared understanding, Snape silently dreamed of hexing him out of the castle, and though he never said it aloud, every sneer made his opinion perfectly clear. Number 9. Reaction to Quidditch. Lockhart couldn't bear not being the expert in the room, even when the topic was Quidditch. After Harry's disastrous fall during the match against Hufflepuff, the one where a rogue bludger shattered his arm, Lockhart rushed to the scene like a showman on cue. "Ah, I see the problem," he said confidently, before anyone could stop him. One wave of his wand and, poof, Harry's bones were gone. Not healed, gone. Later, in the hospital wing, Lockhart visited Harry all smiles and self-importance. He told him that he, too, had been quite the seeker in his day, that he had once caught the snitch with his teeth during a snowstorm in Sheffield. Harry, of course, said nothing. Madame Pomfrey rolled her eyes. Lockhart then proceeded to offer Quidditch tips, including the gem. "Always play to the crowd, Harry. Showmanship counts for a lot in these things." To Lockhart, every subject was a mirror. It wasn't about the sport or the student. It was about the performance. Even when a boy lay in pain, bone-free and sore from the crash, Lockhart couldn't resist stealing the spotlight. And once again, what could have been a moment of real help turned into theatre. Number 10. Ambitions to become headmaster. Lockhart didn't just want applause. He wanted a throne. In Chamber of Secrets, his obsession with image reached new heights when he transformed Hogwarts into a blushing pink nightmare for Valentine's Day. Heart-shaped confetti rained from the enchanted ceiling. Singing dwarves dressed as cupids darted through corridors delivering valentines. It wasn't for the students. It wasn't even for love. It was for Lockhart. "He's trying to get in with Dumbledore," Ron muttered bitterly. "Reckons he'll be next in line for headmaster." Lockhart believed it too. The man who erased memories for fame now wanted to lead the greatest school of magic in Britain. He saw Dumbledore not as a mentor, but as a rival to be charmed. He praised the headmaster publicly, flattered him in meetings, even claimed they were close friends. "I remember when Albus first told me he admired my work with the Yeti," Lockhart would say to anyone listening. Of course, the Yeti story had never happened, but that didn't stop him. Every act of vanity was a campaign, the holiday, the smiles, the endless compliments. None of it was random. Lockhart was playing politics. In his mind, Hogwarts needed a face, not a mind. And who better than the most photogenic wizard alive? That his students learned nothing didn't matter, that his spells failed constantly, minor inconveniences. What mattered was charm, presence, prestige. But Hogwarts isn't a stage, it's a fortress of learning, and the staff saw through him. McGonagall's cold stares, Snape's thinly veiled contempt, Sprout's outright irritation, even the portraits on the wall seemed unimpressed. Lockhart's dream of sitting in Dumbledore's chair never came close, but he believed in it completely, because for Gilderoy Lockhart, belief was always stronger than truth. Number 11. Fan mail and autographs. Gilderoy Lockhart didn't teach magic, he curated his image. At Hogwarts, his office was less a workspace and more a fan club headquarters, walls covered in glossy portraits, each one of him, all smiling, winking, posing, and on his desk, not lesson plans, letters, dozens of them, daily, love notes, compliments, invitations to speak, to dine, to sign more books. He answered them all, by hand, in purple ink. The books make it clear. Harry noticed a large pile of envelopes on Lockhart's desk. He was answering fan mail, not marking homework, not preparing spells, not even pretending to teach. Lockhart believed staying adored was more important than staying competent. Students came to class, but he was often late, too busy responding to a Mrs. Jenkins in Liverpool or a Miss Penelope in Kent who simply adored his chapter on how he defeated the Wagga Wagga werewolf. He even held autograph sessions during school hours. Girls lined up outside his office, clutching signed photos and giggling. Lockhart basked in it. "Just doing my duty, spreading a bit of cheer," he'd say. Meanwhile, Neville Longbottom couldn't cast a basic counter-curse, and Seamus Finnegan's cauldron kept exploding. Lockhart was too occupied posing for enchanted pictures to notice or care. His desk drawers were full of glossy headshots, each ready to be inscribed with some variation of "To my dearest admirer." Teaching? A distraction? Fame? A full-time job? Hogwarts got a celebrity, not a professor, and the students paid the price. Number 12. Attempts to befriend Harry. Lockhart didn't just want Harry's fame, he wanted his friendship, or rather, he wanted to be seen as Harry's mentor, guide, and role model. In Chamber of Secrets, he makes this painfully clear from their very first meeting. "Fame is a fickle friend, Harry," Lockhart says, pulling the boy close for a staged photo at Flourish and Blots. "You must be careful, or it'll go to your head." He says it with a smile, but he means to lecture, to mould, to control. Throughout the school year, Lockhart continues to insert himself into Harry's life. When Harry breaks his arm during a Quidditch match, Lockhart rushes in, not to help, but to show off. "Never fear," he declares. One flick of his wand later, and Harry's bones are gone. Not healed, vanished. The boy spends the night regrowing his arm in the hospital wing. Lockhart's response: "Just a little snag with the wand," he says, waving it off like a minor wardrobe mishap. Lockhart invites Harry to his office. He corners him in corridors. He rambles on about how similar their lives are, how they both must carry the burden of celebrity. "We're not so different, you and I," he insists. But Harry is mortified. He wants nothing more than to escape. The contrast is striking. One boy who never asked for fame, and one man who built his entire identity on stolen spotlight. The more Lockhart tried to force the bond, the more uncomfortable it became. For Harry, these interactions weren't amusing. They were exhausting, and for readers, they were revealing. Lockhart didn't want to guide Harry. He wanted to bask in his glow. He wanted to own a piece of the boy's legend, but Harry Potter was never his to claim. Number 13. Why Dumbledore hired him. Why did Dumbledore, the wisest man in Hogwarts, hire Gilderoy Lockhart? It seems absurd, a fraud, a peacock with a wand. The films never explain it, but the books do. Dumbledore knew exactly who Lockhart was, and that's precisely why he gave him the job. In Chamber of Secrets, Professor McGonagall is the one who asks the question outright. "You mean you knew he was lying, Albus?" she says. Dumbledore doesn't deny it. He answers with calm certainty. "Yes, I suspected as much. But sometimes, Professor, we must let the truth reveal itself. That's Dumbledore's style. He lets people fall by their own hand. Lockhart's ego was a time bomb. All Hogwarts had to do was listen. Lockhart had been dodging scrutiny for years. Book tours, fan mail, glamorous robes, but Hogwarts was different. Here, students ask questions, colleagues observe, magic is tested, and Lockhart? He started to crumble the moment Cornish pixies flew out of his cage. He panicked. Hermione saved the lesson. The cracks widened. By the time he faced the basilisk, he was finished. Dumbledore's gamble worked. The lie collapsed under the weight of truth. Lockhart's final moment, wand raised, spell backfired, wasn't just poetic justice. It was Dumbledore's quiet plan coming to life. The school didn't just expose Lockhart, it cured the myth of Gilderoy Lockhart. One forgotten fraud, sacrificed for a lesson that would never be forgotten. Number 14, his only real spell, Obliviate. Gilderoy Lockhart had one true magical talent, and it wasn't bravery, intelligence, or teaching. It was memory erasure. The Obliviate charm became his signature, not for defense or protection, but for stealing lives and rewriting glory. Lockhart didn't just exaggerate, he took real, heroic acts performed by witches and wizards across the wizarding world and erased them from history. He cast the spell on a brave Armenian warlock who banished a banshee. he wiped the memory of an old witch who survived an encounter with a werewolf pack. Their stories became his chapters. In Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, J.K. Rowling lets us peek behind the curtain. "The stories are all mine," Lockhart boasts in the book, "but the adventures were theirs and I had to take them out of the picture, naturally." His cheerful confession, meant to impress, only confirms his fraudulence. It wasn't courage that led him to fame. It was the precise flick of a wand and a well-practiced lie. But the Obliviate charm is no simple spell. Memory is fragile, yes, but magic is trickier still. In the climax of the Chamber of Secrets, Lockhart tries to erase Harry and Ron's memories in a desperate bid to protect his false legend. "The adventure ends here, boys," he declares. His wand, broken, the spell backfires. The result? Silence, dust, and Lockhart sitting on the floor, blank-eyed, a man emptied by his own tool. The irony is almost poetic. The only spell he ever mastered turned against him. The lies he built over years collapsed in seconds. Gilderoy Lockhart, the best-selling author, the darling of Witch Weekly, forgotten even by himself. Number 15, inability to admit the truth. Gilderoy Lockhart was a man crafted not from heroism, but from the delicate, glimmering threads of illusion. In the glittering corridors of Hogwarts he shone like a charm, and yet behind every dazzling smile and every anecdote of daring feats, there was an echoing silence of truth. Among the many characters that breathed life into J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series, Lockhart stood out as a unique paradox. A man who achieved fame not through valor, but through deception, and whose most defining flaw was his absolute inability to admit it. His tenure as defense against the dark arts teacher in the Chamber of Secrets was marked by outlandish claims and laughable incompetence, but what truly defined Lockhart's character was his pathological aversion to truth. This flaw became a recurring theme throughout the book, shaping not only how others saw him, but more crucially, how he saw himself. It was never enough for Lockhart to bask in unearned praise. He needed to rewrite every narrative in which his true role might be less than glorious. His pride demanded it. His ego required it. After unleashing a swarm of Cornish pixies in his classroom, a decision that quickly descended into chaos, Lockhart failed to subdue them. In fact, it was Neville who ended up dangling from the chandelier, and only Hermione's quick thinking saved the room from further disaster. Yet when the dust settled, Lockhart's response was not one of humility nor even embarrassment. He brushed off the fiasco with the flamboyant declaration that the scene had been entirely intentional. "It was to test your reflexes," he claimed, insisting with unnerving confidence that the children had learned a valuable lesson in coping under pressure. It was a blatant lie, and everyone in the room knew it. But Lockhart delivered it with such flair, such utter conviction, that one almost wanted to believe him. This wasn't a one-time occurrence. Throughout the school year, he layered fabrication upon fabrication, spinning tales of banshee battles and vampire duels, each more ludicrous than the last. In the book, Professor Snape offered a contrast that threw Lockhart's flaws into sharp relief. During a dueling club demonstration, Lockhart's feigned competence was quickly dismantled by Snape's effortless efficiency. Yet even after being publicly humiliated, Lockhart recovered with an impromptu claim that his spell had simply backfired slightly. His world had no room for error, at least not if it belonged to him. What made Lockhart so fascinating wasn't just his lies, but the almost tragic belief that if he repeated them often enough, they might become true. When Ron Weasley doubted one of Lockhart's tales in Chapter 6, Fred Weasley muttered, "He's the only one who thinks he's brilliant." And yet Lockhart's response to the slightest question of his credibility was not introspection, but louder bragging. It was as if silence might allow reality to slip in. So he never allowed silence. His memoirs, stacked high in the Hogwarts library, bore titles like Magical Me and Wandering with Werewolves, each presenting Lockhart as a gallant figure from folklore. But the irony, as revealed later, was that these books were stolen lives. He had tracked down real heroes, extracted their stories, and then erased their memories. That was perhaps the darkest aspect of his persona, not only his refusal to accept the truth, but his active erasure of others' truths to replace them with his own. In Chapter 16, when Harry and Ron confront him before he flees into the chamber, Lockhart confesses his method almost proudly. "Books can be misleading," he says. "You want fame, you have to be prepared for a long, hard slog." But then he shrugs as if none of it matters and admits, "The thing is, I don't do the hard part." Even in the face of his unmasking, he doesn't crumble. Instead, he reaches for a memory charm, but that too fails him. His final attempt at rewriting reality, obliterating the memories of Harry and Ron to protect his myth, backfires when he uses Ron's damaged wand. The spell rebounds, shattering not only the spell's target but Lockhart's own mind. The man who spent a lifetime sculpting illusions was undone by the collapse of the very tool he had wielded so freely. In an act of poetic justice, he became his own casualty, trapped in a mind now void of the false narratives he once treasured. Years later, when Harry visits St. Mungo's hospital in Order of the Phoenix, he finds Lockhart a ghost of his former self. Still cheerful, still signing autographs, but lost. "I expect I was hopeless, was I?" he asks with a smile, showing that perhaps even in the fog of amnesia, his soul remembered enough to grasp his own failure, but not enough to truly understand it. The nurse tells Harry gently, "He still thinks he's famous." That line stings. It's no longer a boast, but a pathetic echo of a man who once lived solely in the eyes of others. Lockhart's inability to accept the truth wasn't simply a character flaw, it was the axis around which his entire identity revolved. Truth, to him, was malleable. Facts were inconvenient details to be swept aside. He didn't lie because he was evil, he lied because he was terrified of being ordinary. In the magical world where great deeds are chronicled in spellbooks and immortalized in portraits, Gilderoy Lockhart carved his legacy not from courage but from fear. Number 16, attitude toward other professors. Of all the professors who ever set foot in the enchanted halls of Hogwarts, few stirred as much exasperation behind the scenes as Gilderoy Lockhart. To the average observer, especially those who only followed his story through the lens of the films, he appeared as a harmless narcissist, vain, yes, but endearingly so. Yet within the pages of the books where his character breathes in fuller form, Lockhart's interactions with his fellow staff members reveal something sharper, an air of condescension sugar-coated with charm, but grating all the same. Gilderoy Lockhart didn't simply crave attention, he demanded reverence, often attempting to elevate himself above the very professors whose experience far exceeded his own. From the moment Lockhart entered Hogwarts as the new Defense Against the Dark Arts professor in Chamber of Secrets, his arrival was met with mixed reactions. While students, especially those less discerning, were dazzled by his flamboyant persona and gleaming smile, the faculty saw through the polish. In his very first meeting with the staff, which we glimpse during various scenes in the Great Hall, he addresses his colleagues with the subtle arrogance of a man who considers himself their superior, an attitude he never bothers to temper, even in the face of skepticism. Take his interactions with Severus Snape, for instance. Snape, the potions master, known for his simmering temper and clipped professionalism, was not one to suffer fools gladly. Lockhart, oblivious or perhaps indifferent, treats him as a misguided novice rather than a peer. During the ill-fated dueling club session, Lockhart seizes the opportunity to demonstrate what he claims are his superior defensive skills, much to Snape's visible irritation. When Snape suggests they demonstrate a duel, Lockhart claps his hands with delight, steps forward, and, smiling broadly, explains to the students how he will disarm his opponent. "Now, Harry, when I point my wand at you, I'll probably use the Expelliarmus charm. It's most effective in disarming," he chirps, but it is Snape who ends the demonstration swiftly and effectively, flinging Lockhart across the room with a flick of his wand. That moment was more than slapstick, it was a perfect metaphor for Lockhart's attitude toward his fellow teachers. He talked down to them with an affable tone, not realizing, or perhaps not caring, that each attempt to instruct or correct them came off as a mockery. His air of superiority wasn't rooted in skill or knowledge, but in a delusional self-image, nurtured by years of self-promotion and lies. Even Professor Sprout, one of the kindest and most patient of the staff, wasn't immune to Lockhart's interference. When mandrakes became essential in reviving the petrified students, Sprout undertook their cultivation with all the care and expertise her position demanded. Yet Lockhart, with no background in herbology, made public comments about how he would have used a special blend of growth solution he once developed while trapped in the jungles of Borneo, a tale that, like all the others, was lifted from someone else's story. Sprout, used to dealing with mischievous students and stubborn plants, offered no public rebuke, but the tightness of her lips during faculty meetings said enough. His behavior toward Professor Flitwick was similarly patronizing. Flitwick, a master of charms and a dueling champion in his youth, represented the kind of quiet, unassuming power that Hogwarts so often cultivated. Yet Lockhart had the gall to suggest improvements to Flitwick's spell work, once even commenting in the staff room that, back when I banished the Banshee of Banbridge, I used a far simpler charm than dear Phileas recommends in his third-year syllabus. The absurdity of such a claim didn't need to be addressed. Flitwick simply returned to his tea, eyebrows raised slightly, lips twitching with amusement. But perhaps the most telling example of Lockhart's disdain for his colleagues lay in his treatment of Madam Hooch and Madam Pince, two staff members often overlooked, but pillars of the school's functioning. When a student was injured during a broom lesson, Lockhart swooped in uninvited and began offering unsolicited advice about proper flying posture and mental harmony with the broom, much to Madam Hooch's fury. The Quidditch coach, never one to mince words, reportedly muttered under her breath in the staff lounge later that evening, "If the man spent half as much time flying as he does preening, he might have made the reserve team back in his school days." Even Madam Pince, the fierce guardian of the library, wasn't spared. When Lockhart donated copies of his books to the restricted section, complete with gaudy autographs and perfumed bookmarks, Pince was livid. She considered his works frivolous and his additions an offence to the dignity of her sacred shelves. She relocated the books to the back of the section, citing structural overcrowding, but every professor knew it was her silent protest. Dumbledore himself maintained a polite but clearly reserved stance toward Lockhart. The headmaster, wise as he was, understood the value of allowing people to reveal their true nature on their own. He rarely contradicted Lockhart publicly, but in private meetings and correspondence, it's likely he shared the doubts that others held. His decision to appoint Lockhart in the first place was more a matter of necessity than choice. Every other candidate had mysteriously refused, a result of the cursed position. Minerva McGonagall, ever the stern voice of reason, was perhaps the most visibly sceptical of Lockhart. Her expressions during his rambling speeches and disruptive lessons spoke volumes. In one staff meeting, Lockhart suggested reworking the Defense Against the Dark Arts curriculum to include weekly readings from Magical Me, prompting McGonagall to cough rather loudly into her tea. When he proposed an autograph day in the entrance hall, she firmly stated, "Our corridors are already congested enough without fans queuing for personalized dedications." Lockhart's need to dominate conversations wasn't limited to staff meetings. During meals in the Great Hall, he often commandeered the attention of the table, launching into tales of supposed heroism. He once described in lurid detail how he had escaped a coven of vampires in Eastern Europe using only a mirror and a handful of garlic cloves. Professor Binns, the ghostly history of magic teacher who barely noticed the living, even paused mid-lecture one day to mention the tale with a hint of derision, noting, "History, alas, is rarely so flamboyant in its truth." Number 17. Panic in the face of danger. Gilderoy Lockhart sparkled with brilliance, but only under the illusion of safety. In the eyes of the public, he was a dazzling figure, a whirlwind of perfect hair, winning smiles and exaggerated tales. Yet behind every grin, behind each signed photograph and self-aggrandizing anecdote, lurked a truth never revealed in the glossy pages of Magical Me. Lockhart, the flamboyant celebrity professor of Hogwarts, bore one trait that defined him more profoundly than vanity or fraudulence: a paralyzing, desperate fear of real danger. It was a fear so deep that even the suggestion of actual peril sent him spiraling into irrational, sometimes absurd, reactions. J.K. Rowling's depiction of Lockhart in the Chamber of Secrets novel contrasts starkly with his portrayal in the film adaptation. Where the movie shows him as merely foolish and inept, the book lays bare the raw terror that governed his every move when the veil of pretension was lifted. The most striking instance of this fear comes in the wake of Ginny Weasley's disappearance. Hogwarts is gripped by a chilling silence as rumours of the legendary Chamber of Secrets swirl through the corridors. Dumbledore is gone, McGonagall is acting headmistress, and the school stands on the edge of closing its doors. The staff gathers in her office, grave and uncertain. In that heavy moment, McGonagall utters the unthinkable: someone must go down into the chamber to rescue the girl. Lockhart's reaction is immediate and pitiful. He has spent the entire year boasting about his encounters with monsters, claiming to have banished banshees and subdued werewolves. He speaks of his books as if they are memoirs, authentic records of heroic deeds. And yet the moment real heroism is demanded, the man begins to unravel. The staff, fed up with his antics, declare that since he has claimed such expertise, he should be the one to act. The truth is that Lockhart never expected to be challenged. His entire career had been built on fabrications, polished interviews and memory charms. "You mean you're running away?" said Harry, when he and Ron find Lockhart in his office, packing in a frenzy. Not only was he escaping, but he was doing so with a flourish worthy of his delusional pride. "I'll just have to leave," he said. "Goodbye, good luck, hope you don't get killed." He even packed a peacock feather quill, and, according to the book, a caged peacock that belonged to Madame Pince, the librarian. This detail, so often omitted in retellings, reveals how Lockhart clung to appearances even as he fled. He wanted to be seen as grand and gallant in his departure, even as his actions screamed cowardice. That moment in the office is not just comical, it is tragic. It is the culmination of a year's worth of deceit. Lockhart had convinced himself that he could keep up the charade indefinitely. Hogwarts, in his mind, was just another stage. But real danger, the kind that screams in your bones and threatens to swallow you whole, does not tolerate actors. It demands authenticity, sacrifice and bravery, none of which Lockhart possessed. Rowling writes, books can be misleading, and in Lockhart's case, they were carefully engineered lies. He had tracked down the real heroes of the tales he claimed, stolen their stories, and wiped their memories. His charm spell was memory itself, but spells, like reputations, are fragile when tested. The wand, his tool of deception, became his downfall. The descent into the Chamber of Secrets marks the full exposure of Lockhart's fear. Forced by Harry and Ron to accompany them, he goes reluctantly. He is jittery, sweat beads forming, his confidence draining with every step. He drags behind, tries to stall. When they reach the tunnel, he seizes his last chance. He snatches Ron's wand, broken from an earlier mishap, and aims it at them with trembling hands. His plan is simple and horrifying: erase their memories, then claim he alone had discovered the chamber. The cowardice of the act is compounded by the fact that he aims to leave two children lost in the bowels of a cursed castle, all for the preservation of his fame. But fate and the faulty wand have other plans. The spell rebounds Obliviate, and instead of erasing their memories, it erases his own. The irony is bitter and poetic. A man who spent his life wiping truth from others now has his own mind wiped clean. This collapse is more than physical. When Lockhart is found later in the chamber, he is a shell of the man he was. The peacock feathers, the robes, the carefully curated identity, all useless. He looks at the mirror and doesn't even recognize himself. "Hello," he says cheerfully. "Odd sort of place this, isn't it? Do you live here?" The terror that had driven him is gone, replaced by a void. His fear led him to destruction. In seeking to avoid danger at all costs, he fell victim to the very fate he feared most, irrelevance. What Lockhart feared was not just pain or monsters, he feared being unmasked. Real danger for him was not a basilisk or a dark tunnel, it was exposure. And that exposure came not with a scream, but with a slow unravelling, a tumble through lies into the hard stone floor of reality. Rowling doesn't just mock Lockhart, she dissects him. The novel uses his fear to show what happens when illusion meets necessity. Throughout the book, other characters confront fear and rise above it. Hermione risks everything to find answers, taking Polyjuice Potion that could go wrong. Ron and Harry follow the trail into the unknown, driven not by pride but by loyalty and courage. Even Ginny, terrified and manipulated, shows strength in her silence. Lockhart, in contrast, crumbles. He is a mirror to the reader, not of what we admire, but of what we dread becoming. This moment, omitted in its full depth from the film, is critical. The movie renders him as comic relief. The book presents a more layered figure, a man whose cowardice is not funny but dangerous. He teaches us that arrogance can masquerade as bravery, and that the loudest voices often have the weakest convictions. When Harry and Ron confront him, it is not a battle of wits, it is a confrontation between substance and sham. Number 18. What happened to him after Hogwarts? Gilderoy. Lockhart was a man made of mirrors, every reflection crafted, rehearsed and polished. When he entered the Great Hall of Hogwarts for the first time as the new Defense Against the Dark Arts professor, robes swirling like theatre curtains, smile blazing like a Lumos charm, he dazzled an entire generation of students. Yet it was all a fragile construction. And when that shimmering facade shattered beneath the stone corridors of the Chamber of Secrets, what remained was not the man, but the myth undone. After the events in the Chamber of Secrets, Lockhart's fate seems to vanish into silence, especially in the cinematic versions of the story. The films, though vivid and charming, gently draw a curtain over his future. But in the books, J.K. Rowling leaves a trail of breadcrumbs, delicate but significant, leading to a place far removed from fame and spotlight. Lockhart, once the embodiment of glitter and grandeur, becomes a symbol of lost identity, tragic irony, and the uncomfortable consequences of fraudulent glory. The memory charm, which he had used so carelessly on others, rebounded against him with poetic justice. Attempting to erase Harry and Ron's memories using Ron's broken wand, the spell backfired spectacularly. Lockhart's mind, once a vault of false stories stolen from others, was left in ruins. He became, in essence, a ghost of himself, breathing, smiling, existing, but no longer knowing who he was. St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries became his new stage. In the Janus Thicky ward, a long-term care unit for permanent spell damage, Lockhart settled into a routine entirely unlike the life he once celebrated in his many published books. He lived among patients whose afflictions had severed them from the world they once knew, people who had been cursed, hexed, or simply forgotten by the society that didn't know what to do with them anymore. Lockhart's case was tragic, but not uncommon in its setting. Yet his presence added a strange charm to the ward, as revealed in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, when Harry, Ron, Hermione and the Weasleys visited Mr. Arthur Weasley at St. Mungo's. They stumbled upon Lockhart by accident. He was still there years later, lounging in his hospital gown, his hair oddly coiffed, and a peacock quill poised in his hand. He signed an autograph for a fan with the same easy flourish he had used in his glory days, entirely unaware of what he was doing or why it mattered. Healer Smethwick says I'm to get a lot of rest, you know. Lots of rest, Lockhart told them, smiling like a child, who's repeated a line drilled into him many times. Order of the Phoenix, Chapter 23. There was no malice in his tone, no self-awareness, just a soft echo of the man he used to be. The absence of memory had stripped away the vanity, but oddly, not the persona. Lockhart had become the performance, even if he no longer remembered rehearsing it. What makes Lockhart's condition so striking is the tension between who he once pretended to be and who he now genuinely is. He had fabricated every tale, stolen every story, and performed heroism without ever lifting a wand in danger. But now, stripped of all ego and knowledge, he still received fan mail. It arrived in bundles, letters from witches enchanted by the image he had once sold so effectively. He showed them to visitors with pride as though they proved something valuable. And perhaps they did, in a way that neither he nor his admirers understood. The hospital staff, it seems, indulged him gently. His walls were decorated with glittering cards, portraits of his former book covers, and small trinkets that reminded no one but the onlooker of who he used to be. There is something both comic and heartbreaking in that. Lockhart lived in the shell of fame, like a retired actor performing for an audience long gone. His identity had fractured, but the world he once deceived never truly let go of the fantasy he had created. The irony, of course, is hard to ignore. The man who erased the memories of others to build his own legacy became his own victim. In losing his mind, he also lost all the lies he had so carefully cultivated, and yet the truth never fully replaced them. Instead of becoming a cautionary tale or a disgraced fraud, he became something else, an innocent, albeit lost, remnant of an elaborate illusion. Hermione, ever the sharp observer, noted that his condition was unlikely to improve. Her expression when seeing him was one of pity rather than scorn. Even Ron, who had once been Lockhart's harshest critic, seemed subdued by the encounter. There was no justice in what happened to Lockhart, no clear line of punishment and redemption. It simply was. The spell broke more than just his mind. It broke the myth and left behind a man none of them could truly hate anymore. Lockhart's downfall is one of the quiet tragedies in the Harry Potter universe. It doesn't roar like a battlefield loss or the death of a beloved character. It doesn't involve dark lords or forbidden curses. It's small, subdued, and utterly human. And yet it lingers precisely because it reflects the consequences of ego, the fragility of identity, and the cost of deception. In a way, Lockhart's story also speaks to the fickleness of fame. For a man who craved attention and applause, who cultivated an image more than a life, he ended up adored by those who only knew the mask. The real Gilderoy Lockhart, flawed, frightened, and false, was never loved, but the fictional hero he invented lived on in hearts and letters. That strange divide between the man and the myth becomes even more poignant when one realizes that due to his condition, Lockhart himself could no longer tell them apart. There's a moment in that hospital room when he holds up a Valentine's Day card, decked in glitter and roses, and grins with boyish delight. There is no recognition, no understanding, just pleasure in the object itself. It's a fragment of joy, divorced from meaning yet sincere. That is perhaps the most haunting part of his fate. He does not suffer as others might. His mind, emptied of ambition, vanity, and guilt, knows only the surface emotions, smiles, confusion, fleeting happiness. He is both untouched and undone. Lockhart's placement in the Janus Thicky ward also holds symbolic weight. The name itself, Janus, the Roman god of duality, of doors and transitions, could not be more fitting. Lockhart was always two-faced, the charming hero on the cover and the coward behind it. Now in that ward he embodies another duality, the man he used to be and the man he became. The door between those selves has closed forever, but we, the readers, are left looking through the keyhole. What makes Lockhart such a compelling character is that he is neither villain nor victim in the traditional sense. He is a man destroyed by his own artifice. And Rowling, with her keen eye for human flaws, allows him to drift into a future that is neither damning nor redemptive. It's simply quiet, forgotten in the grander narrative, but never erased. Even within the chaos of the Second Wizarding War, Lockhart's fate remains unchanged. There are no newspaper headlines about his miraculous recovery, no dramatic return to the public eye. He is not swept into the currents of resistance or rebellion. He stays in that hospital, turning pages of blank memory, basking in the adoration of fans he cannot remember, surrounded by echoes of stories he never lived. To some readers, Lockhart's fate might seem too merciful. He was a fraud, after all, a man who profited from the pain of others. Yet to others, his downfall is more than enough, to lose not just your memory but the very understanding of what you've done. There's a particular cruelty in that, a punishment that does not feel like punishment, and thus lingers longer in the conscience. Years after first meeting Lockhart in the pages of Chamber of Secrets, his presence in Order of the Phoenix remains one of the series' most unsettling callbacks. It reminds us that magic, while wondrous, is not without consequences, that the mind, more than the body, is vulnerable to spells gone wrong, and that even the most glittering of figures can be reduced to silence and smiles. Lockhart's story is not one of redemption, but of unravelling. He does not come back stronger, nor does he atone. He fades into the background, a soft whisper of fame. And in that silence lies a truth more powerful than any of his fabricated tales. The price of dishonesty, when paid in full, is not always loud or dramatic. It is the quiet loss of self. In the end, he remains a character of contradictions. Loved for falsehoods, forgotten in truth. A man who once filled stadiums with book readings, now surrounded by the gentle hum of hospital wards and the rustling of envelopes he cannot understand. He is a reminder, perhaps, that memory is not just what we have, it is what we are. And when it slips away, so too does the illusion of control we once held over the stories we told the world. Number 19. His books were a lie. In the brightly lit corridors of Hogwarts, where portraits whisper and staircases shift, one name gleamed from the glossy covers of bestsellers stacked on the shelves of Flourish and Blots: Gilderoy Lockhart. To the casual observer, he was the embodiment of wizarding success, a cascade of golden curls, robes embroidered with his own smiling face, and a seemingly endless string of adventures chronicled in his books. But behind that winning grin and polished charm lurked a truth so vile it was barely believable. Every tale he told, every danger he claimed to have faced, every spell he boasted of mastering, they were all stolen, not metaphorically, literally. Lockhart's deception was not one of harmless embellishment or boastful ego. It was orchestrated theft, methodical, magical, and malicious. In Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, the truth begins to surface. When Harry and Ron corner him in the dungeons as the school trembles under the threat of the basilisk, Lockhart finally admits what his adoring fans never imagined. "Books can be misleading," he says, with the same smirk that once graced the cover of Holidays with Hags. But what he reveals next strips away the illusion. "I'm afraid I didn't do those things. I'm rather good at memory charms." And with those words, a legacy of lies crumbles. The books that lined the windows of Diagon Alley, that students carried with excitement into defense against the dark arts class, were forged through treachery. Take Wanderings with Werewolves, for example. In it, Lockhart details a harrowing night trapped in the Carpathian Mountains with a pack of bloodthirsty lycanthropes. The chapter is gripping. Dramatic howls, biting winds, silver blades glinting under a full moon. But the reality? The story belonged to an aging Hungarian wizard named Oldrich Farkas, a true expert in werewolf handling, who vanished from the public eye after giving one interview to a charismatic young man with a quill and too much charm. Each of Lockhart's books followed this same sinister formula. He would track down true heroes, listen to their tales under the pretense of writing a profile or seeking inspiration, and then, once the story was his, obliterate the witness's memory with a well-aimed Obliviate. The cost of his fame was the silencing of real courage. Gadding with Ghouls stole the achievements of a stooped Irish witch who had spent her life studying the habits of spectral beings haunting the cliffs of Moher. The Voyages with Vampires. Lifted from the journals of a Romanian aura who specialized in dark creature diplomacy. The names of these real heroes, their risks, their near-deaths, all erased. The magic behind Lockhart's deception wasn't merely in his Obliviate spell, it was in the performance. He cultivated an image so radiant, so immaculately heroic, that few dared question him. He dazzled parents, charmed professors, and made even the skeptical question their instincts. Yet what is perhaps most chilling is how complicit the wizarding world became in his illusion. Bookstores promoted his face, magazines published his smiling portraits. Hogwarts appointed him as a teacher. Nobody checked, nobody asked. The idea that a man could be that brave, that prolific, that universally loved, it was too delightful to resist. Lockhart's classroom at Hogwarts was not a sanctuary of learning, but a shrine to his own ego. Photographs of himself blinked flirtatiously from gilded frames. Students were assigned reading material that did not teach spells or technique, but instead worshipped at the altar of his false achievements. He made students reenact scenes from his books, dramas born from lies, forcing them to internalize and believe the fiction he had woven. The irony, of course, is bitter. Hogwarts sought a defender of children, and instead hired a master of illusion. There is something particularly disturbing in the way Lockhart treated knowledge. In the wizarding world, stories and spells are not mere curiosities. They can mean the difference between life and death. A book is a vessel of wisdom, passed down through generations. Lockhart, however, treated books as vehicles of self-promotion. His pages were not meant to educate, only to elevate his fame. The best-selling author of Magical Me became his identity, and everything else, the cost, the victims, was buried beneath the sheen of celebrity. Perhaps the most damning moment in Lockhart's unravelling came in the second-year confrontation in the Chamber of Secrets. Armed with Ron's wand, broken and unpredictable, he attempted once more to erase witnesses to his failures. He lifted the wand and proclaimed, "The adventure ends here, boys. I shall have to do a memory charm on you." But the wand backfired. In poetic justice, Lockhart's own mind was erased. The man who had spent his life silencing truth was now silenced himself. He became what he had made of others, a forgotten name with no past. The books remained, though. Long after Lockhart's exposure, his titles still gathered dust in libraries, still clung to the shelves of second-hand bookstores. And this, too, speaks volumes. The magical community's willingness to continue consuming the work of a fraud reveals a collective failure to value authenticity over glamour. Even Professor Snape, when sarcastically critiquing Lockhart's curriculum, remarked, "I couldn't understand why you were given this job." It wasn't just a bad hiring choice. It was emblematic of a deeper issue, a society in love with the surface, blind to the depths. There is tragedy, too, in the forgotten victims, those witches and wizards whose lives were wiped clean by a single flash of light. The stories they carried, the wisdom they earned, were never recovered. One can only imagine the haunted expressions of those who looked around, lost in their own homes, unsure of who they were. How many potential professors, mentors, or researchers did the wizarding world lose to Lockhart's insatiable ambition? The cost was not just moral, it was historical. Even in St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies, where Lockhart now resides in a permanent fog, the consequences of his deception echo. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, when Harry visits the hospital, he finds Lockhart cheerfully signing autographs for imaginary fans. The irony is painful. His mind, shattered, now believes in a fiction that was always fake. "He still thinks he's famous," says the healer with a sad smile. Fame was his identity. Without it, there is nothing left of him but a hollow echo. And yet, his books remain remarkably well written. The prose flows, the drama captivates. This is the genius of Lockhart's grift. He was not merely a thief of deeds, he was an artist of lies. He knew how to structure a tale, when to crescendo, when to twist, when to offer a false vulnerability. His writing was bait and the world took it, hook, line, and sinker. His talents, tragically, were real, but wasted on fabrication. The visual media adaptation, in all its wonder and richness, failed to capture the extent of this betrayal. In the film version of Chamber of Secrets, Lockhart is comic relief, vain, bumbling, ridiculous. But this softens the truth. In the book, he is something darker, a predator of memory, a usurper of heroism. His story is not just about a charlatan, it's about the ease with which evil can wear a smile and a silk robe and charm its way into the hearts of millions. It is worth asking, why does Lockhart's deception disturb us so deeply? Perhaps it is because it plays on a universal fear that our achievements could be stolen, our sacrifices forgotten, our names replaced by a louder voice with a better wardrobe. His betrayal is not merely personal, it is communal. He robbed the wizarding world of inspiration that might have come from real heroes. In the end, Lockhart's story is not one of downfall but warning. It is a tale about the dangers of unchecked admiration, of blind hero worship. It teaches that true courage rarely comes with a book deal or a signing tour. Real bravery, like that of Lupin, Tonks, or even Neville Longbottom, comes quietly, often painfully, and without reward. The heroes Lockhart silenced had no voice to shout with, they only had the truth, and he took that from them. The next time a young witch or wizard lifts a copy of Magical Me, they might laugh at the absurdity, the drama, the sparkle, but perhaps they should pause. Whose story is this really? Whose danger, whose spell, whose scars? Lockhart's name may be on the cover, but the true author, the one who fought, who nearly died, who believed their story might help others, is lost to history. Erased. That is the legacy of Gilderoy Lockhart. Not fame, not humour, not even tragedy, but absence, an empty space where once stood truth. The wizarding world, so eager for glitter, mistook it for gold, and by the time the shine wore off, the real heroes had vanished, nameless, into the shadows of a lie. Number 20, gift sets and Lockhart merchandise. Few characters in the Harry Potter universe embody the art of self-promotion like Gilderoy Lockhart. A master not of magic, but of image, Lockhart was less concerned with the substance of his spells and more invested in the sparkle of his smile, the gleam of his golden locks and the sheen of his signature ink. What the films largely brushed aside, the books paint vividly. Gilderoy Lockhart was a walking brand, and his classroom at Hogwarts quickly became the showroom of a man selling more than just defense against the dark arts. He was selling himself. The most blatant example of this came in the form of Lockhart's personalized gift sets. Exclusive collections of autographed photographs, signed editions of his books, and even, most extravagantly, locks of his famous honey-blonde hair. These were not mere memorabilia, they were relics of self-made legend. Crafted and marketed by Lockhart himself, they became instant objects of desire for a very specific demographic, middle-aged witches, many of whom revered him not just as an author, but as a charming, chiseled icon of magical culture. In Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, J.K. Rowling details the phenomenon with careful satire. During Lockhart's first lesson, the students find on their desks a stack of all 7 of his published works, including such grandly titled tomes as Magical Me, Gadding with Ghouls, and Holidays with Hags. "I have the greatest respect for Professor Dumbledore, of course," he proclaims, "but he did make a mistake in giving me this job." There was no hint of humility, but what's more telling is how his curriculum was just another layer of self-promotion, each assigned reading being a Lockhart-authored piece, each lesson an opportunity to elevate his fame further. It wasn't just the students who were swept up in the Lockhart brand. Madam Pince, the usually stern Hogwarts librarian, was reportedly seen dusting Lockhart's shelf in the library with an unusual tenderness. Witches in Diagon Alley clamoured for his signature, gushing and fanning themselves with his glossy portrait cards. He became a cottage industry, with advertisements for Lockhart-themed cauldron cases, robes bearing his embroidered initials, and even talking quills that recited quotes from his books in his own voice. Wrestled with a werewolf? "My hair was still perfect," they would chirp, to the delight of his fans. In one scene, Rowling introduces a particularly bizarre item, a limited edition Gilderoy Lockhart hair preservation charm kit, which he proudly handed out during a book signing at Flourish and Blotts. These kits supposedly included a single strand of his hair, encased in glass, and instructions on how to keep it magically preserved for eternity. While it may have sounded preposterous, it sold out within hours. There were even rumours that a few ambitious witches attempted duplication charms on the hair, hoping to clone the man himself, a feat thankfully well beyond their abilities. Even in the hallowed halls of Hogwarts, Lockhart never ceased being a salesman. He encouraged his students to buy the full set of his books, suggesting, not so subtly, that without them they'd never pass his class. "You will need to read Magical Me by Monday," he declared, "and I expect a 2-foot-long essay on Chapter 1, The Journey Begins." This was not just a class, it was a carefully orchestrated campaign, with the students unwittingly becoming his brand ambassadors. His office was a shrine to himself, every inch of the walls plastered with self-portraits in which he grinned, winked, or held a dazzling smile frozen mid-pose. Hermione Granger, ever the diligent student, was one of the few who did not see through the farce immediately. She seemed genuinely enthralled by Lockhart's presence and eagerly wrote the essays he demanded, citing his chapters with a seriousness that Ron Weasley found nauseating. "You know, he's just a peacock in peacock's clothing," Ron muttered one evening, rolling his eyes. But even he couldn't deny that Lockhart's hold on people was potent. It wasn't magic, it was marketing. One particular anecdote captures Lockhart's commercial genius and ego in one glittering package. During a school event organised to raise funds for the Magical Maladies ward at St. Mungo's, Lockhart donated a deluxe Lockhart fan basket for the auction. It included 10 signed books, a full-length poster of Lockhart in dragonhide robes, a scented candle that smelled vaguely like his cologne, called Bravery, and a personal message pre-recorded in a singing mirror. The bidding war that ensued between 3 middle-aged witches nearly caused a magical fire when one's wand flared from excitement. Students at Hogwarts quickly learned that the fastest way to receive Lockhart's favour was through the wallet. Lavender Brown and Parvati Patil often sported Lockhart's enchanted pins on their robes, which glowed in the dark and whispered, "Top marks for effort, darling," whenever the girls turned in homework. Dean Thomas once quipped that Lockhart probably charged his mirror to compliment him in the mornings, a joke that proved prescient when it was discovered that Lockhart's mirror did flatter him in 7 different dialects. But perhaps the most telling moment came when Harry Potter himself was forced to pose with Lockhart for a photo shoot arranged by the Daily Prophet. The young wizard had no interest in the spotlight, yet Lockhart seized the opportunity to turn the encounter into another marketing bonanza. Rowling writes, he seized Harry's arm and dragged him forward, still beaming for the cameras. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said loudly, waving one arm around Harry's shoulders, "what an extraordinary moment this is." The photograph, of course, was turned into a promotional postcard. Lockhart's commercialization reached such heights that even Fred and George Weasley, not ones to pass up an entrepreneurial opportunity, began imitating his tactics. They produced their own spoof versions of Lockhart's gear, such as Lockhart's luscious locks, fake wigs enchanted to sing self-praising lullabies, and Magical Me, the unauthorized parody, which included blank pages and a mirror. When questioned, Fred remarked, "Hey, if he can make galleons off selling himself, why can't we?" Yet the most absurd example of Lockhart's branding was perhaps the hair elixir of heroism, a potion he claimed to have invented after a daring escape from a tribe of banshees. Marketed in sparkling vials with his smiling face etched into the glass, it was said to make hair thicker, shinier, and more courageous. The product had no magical effect beyond smelling like rosemary and lemon zest, but it sold by the crate. One witch wrote to Witch Weekly declaring, "I apply it every day, and I've never felt braver." Lockhart's shameless self-promotion also extended into his correspondence. He responded to every fan letter, through magically reproduced handwriting, of course, and included with each reply a folded glossy photo of himself riding a hippogriff, complete with a quote in gold foil. "To dream is to dare, and I dare magnificently." While others taught transfiguration or potions, Lockhart was busy cultivating a cult of personality. What makes Lockhart's merchandise mania so fascinating is how thoroughly it contrasts with the values of the magical world. In a society that largely prized modesty, lineage, or magical achievement, Lockhart had built an empire on fiction, charm, and hairspray. His classroom was less about learning and more about watching a man bask in his own glow. Yet for all its absurdity, it worked, at least until the truth caught up. When his secrets were revealed, that he had stolen other wizards' stories and memories, his empire collapsed. But even in St. Mungo's hospital, where he was later confined with memory loss, he clung to his old habits. As Rowling tells us in Order of the Phoenix, Lockhart still handed out autographs with childlike delight. He couldn't remember why people knew his name, but he still believed they should have his signature. Fame, after all, was the deepest enchantment he had ever cast, especially on himself. The films, regrettably, did not delve into this gloriously ridiculous side of Lockhart. While Kenneth Branagh delivered a delightfully pompous performance, the merchandising madness, the obsessive fan culture, and the sheer scope of his self-promotion were largely absent. Gone were the kits with hair, the cologne candles, and the enchanted pins. This omission left moviegoers with only a glimpse of the full, glittering absurdity that Lockhart represented. It is in the books that Lockhart truly comes alive, not as a villain, but as a cautionary tale in golden robes. He is a wizard not of wands, but of vanity, a professor whose greatest lesson had nothing to do with magic, and everything to do with the perils of believing your own myth. In the end, the only spell Lockhart truly mastered was branding, and like all powerful enchantments, it worked until it didn't. In the cluttered archives of Hogwarts history, his name is remembered not for bravery, but for the breathtaking audacity of a man who sold pieces of himself in pretty boxes. His fans may have moved on, but somewhere, in the drawer of a middle-aged witch's nightstand, lies a vial of golden hair, still glimmering with hope and hairspray. Number 21, sensitivity to criticism. Of all the flamboyant personalities to ever grace the halls of Hogwarts, Gilderoy Lockhart stood alone as a man wrapped tightly in the golden threads of his own legend. With each step, he carried the weight of fabricated glory, heavy not in truth but in the effort required to maintain it. Beneath the polished smile, the brilliant teeth, and the swirl of violet robes lay a man whose greatest fear was not failure, but exposure. In Lockhart's carefully curated world, criticism was not merely inconvenient, it was a threat to the illusion he so desperately clung to. And few things unnerved him more than when that illusion was placed under scrutiny. From his first entrance in Chamber of Secrets, Lockhart made it clear he was accustomed to applause, not analysis. When Professor McGonagall introduced him to the students, he immediately launched into a performance, assuming admiration was the only reaction his presence could provoke. But the cracks in his facade became visible the moment skepticism entered the room. Whenever a student or colleague questioned the veracity of his exploits, Lockhart's smile faltered, just for a heartbeat, before he smothered the moment with a dazzling anecdote. His defense mechanism was not defense at all, but distraction. During a lesson when Hermione asked about the Wagga Wagga werewolf, a creature Lockhart claimed to have subdued single-handedly, there was a flicker of something in his eyes, not pride, but alertness. He sensed the inquiry was leading somewhere dangerous. Before she could elaborate, he launched into an embellished tale that wandered far from the original point. "Let me tell you," he said, with theatrical flair. "There I was, standing alone, just me and the beast, and, oh, it's all in Chapter 12 of Wanderings with Werewolves." That was Lockhart's signature move, drowning doubt in performance. He used his books like shields, waving them as proof rather than evidence. Lockhart's relationship with critics was rooted in fear. He had not lived the feats described in his books. He had stolen them from others, modified the facts, and erased the original heroes with memory charms. This house of cards, constructed on amnesia and ego, left no room for contradiction. So when critics, be they students, staff, or readers, raised questions, Lockhart responded with charming hostility. His smile became a weapon, his praise turned to condescension. Every challenge to his story was met with a new tale, even more ludicrous than the last, designed to dazzle and disorient rather than clarify. When Snape challenged him to a duel in the dueling club, Lockhart's first instinct was to perform. But when it came to actual magic, true, observable, practical skill, his deficiencies became painfully clear. Snape's disarming spell sent Lockhart flying across the room, much to the amusement of the students. And in that moment, his reaction wasn't one of embarrassment or humility, but of fragile deflection. "Ah, yes," he exclaimed, brushing off his robes. "A little demonstration of how to let one's opponent get the best of you, just for teaching purposes." He refused to acknowledge failure. Every stumble was twisted into a teaching moment, another story for a future book. It was in these moments of public embarrassment that Lockhart's true self began to emerge. Not the confident adventurer, but the desperate pretender gasping for control. Criticism didn't just bruise his ego, it shattered the illusion he lived within. His need for control over the narrative was obsessive. When Colin Creevey once asked if he could photograph Lockhart in a heroic pose, Lockhart insisted on adjusting the scene, the lighting, the angle, even the background. He micromanaged every detail not because he cared about art, but because he feared being seen as anything less than perfect. One of the most telling scenes of Lockhart's fear of criticism came when Professor Sprout casually mentioned the bravery of other wizards in her herbology class. Lockhart, hearing this, appeared behind her, offering a thin-lipped smile and quickly redirecting the conversation to his most daring brush with Devil's Snare, which he claimed to have survived using only a well-timed joke and a dash of sunlight. There was an edge to his voice, just enough to signal he was uncomfortable. For Lockhart, every mention of another wizard's bravery was a potential dagger. His interaction with the press reveals another layer of this fragile facade. In Chamber of Secrets, he boasts, "I didn't get rid of the Bandon Banshee by smiling at her." But we know he didn't get rid of the Bandon Banshee at all. It was someone else entirely. The line, delivered with overconfidence, was in response to skepticism from the staff. His tone was that of a man cornered, mocking, theatrical, but shaky beneath the surface. He couldn't afford for anyone to pull at the threads of his tapestry of lies. Even among students, Lockhart's charm wore thin. Ron Weasley, never one to hold back his opinion, muttered to Harry that he didn't believe half of what Lockhart wrote. Harry, more reserved, simply observed the man with growing suspicion. And Lockhart? He seemed to sense it. Every time a student rolled their eyes, he would react not with genuine engagement, but with forced charm. "Ah, young minds, so full of doubt, but you'll learn. Oh yes, you'll see." He didn't teach out of passion, he performed out of fear. Lockhart's use of humour was another layer of armour. When someone questioned his magical advice, such as using a homorphous charm against werewolves, he would chuckle lightly, wave a hand and say, "Oh, but it worked for me." Never mind that it was dangerous, inaccurate, or entirely invented. His laughter wasn't genuine, it was desperate. It was the kind of laugh that covers trembling hands. He couldn't risk confrontation, so he disguised deflection as entertainment. There was a constant need to redirect. When Minerva McGonagall once asked him about his method for countering pixie infestations, a scenario he claimed to have faced dozens of times, Lockhart stammered for a beat, then declared, "Best not to bore the students with technicalities," before launching into a story about Cornwall and a particularly mischievous pixie named Pierre. He never answered the question. He never provided proof, because there was none. What makes Lockhart such a tragic figure is the sheer magnitude of his self-deception. He wasn't just lying to others. He had begun to believe in the necessity of his performance. In his mind, being admired was more important than being genuine. When Hermione praised his hair, he beamed with pride, yet if someone had pointed out a wrinkle in his story, that same pride would curdle into contempt. He lived for praise and withered under doubt. Perhaps the most haunting moment of Lockhart's collapse came near the end of Chamber of Secrets, when Harry and Ron forced him to accompany them into the hidden chamber. Cornered and desperate, Lockhart revealed the ultimate tool in his arsenal, memory charms. "The adventure ends here, boys. I shall have to do the thing myself," he declared, wand trembling. But his wand, having been Ron's broken one, backfired. In a single flash, the great illusionist was undone, and his response? Not terror, but confusion. "Who am I?" he asked. the very question his critics had been asking for years. In that instant, stripped of memory, Lockhart became free of ego. No more stories, no more masks. He wandered St. Mungo's later with flowers in his hand, humming to himself, unaware of his own deception. Ironically, it was only in forgetfulness that he found peace. The man who once feared criticism more than death now lived without the burden of a reputation to defend. It was a poetic punishment, and perhaps a gentle mercy. Critics never had to destroy Lockhart. He did it to himself. His identity was a house, built on the sand of falsehoods. The more he added to it, the more unstable it became. Each critic was like a gust of wind, and each time he responded with denial, distraction, or arrogance. He never faced the truth, and the truth in the end was all that remained. Lockhart stands as a warning in the wizarding world, not just about vanity or pride, but about the corrosive power of fear. He was a man so afraid of being ordinary that he pretended to be extraordinary, and in doing so he erased the real heroes, those brave enough to act without applause, to fight without fame. His story is not one of villainy, but of deep insecurity masquerading as greatness, and yet for all his faults, Lockhart was a product of a world that rewarded spectacle over substance. The Daily Prophet adored him. The wizarding public bought every book. In truth, they helped him build the pedestal from which he would eventually fall. They did not ask for proof. They did not question the details. They simply applauded. And applause, as Lockhart knew, was the most dangerous kind of silence. In a different life, perhaps Lockhart could have been a successful writer of fiction, a performer with flair, a harmless entertainer. But he craved more. He wanted to be remembered, not for who he was, but for who he pretended to be. His reaction to criticism, swift, theatrical, and evasive, was not just about avoiding shame. It was about survival. For Lockhart, truth was poison and praise was air. And so he breathed deeply until the illusion consumed him. And somewhere, in the quiet ward of St. Mungo's, the echoes of those lies have faded. The critics are silent now, their voices irrelevant to the man who no longer remembers why he feared them in the first place. Number 22 tried to replace Dumbledore. There was a moment in the second book of J.K. Rowling's beloved series Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets that flickered like lightning in a storm of far more dangerous and mystical events, a moment so absurd and yet so revealing that it remains one of the finest portraits of delusion ever painted in the wizarding world. Gilderoy Lockhart, the flamboyant fraud, whose toothy grin and vanity filled countless pages of his own bestsellers, once sincerely believed he was the ideal replacement for Albus Dumbledore as headmaster of Hogwarts. In the dark times when the Chamber of Secrets had been opened and terror spread like cold fog through the castle, the school found itself momentarily without its most powerful protector. Dumbledore, removed from his position due to pressure from the Ministry of Magic and Lucius Malfoy's scheming, left a gaping hole in the heart of the school's leadership. It was then, in this unsettling vacuum, that Lockhart rose, not like a phoenix from the ashes, but like a peacock strutting into a burning building. Lockhart's ambition was no secret. From the moment he stepped into the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom, adorned in robes as loud as his voice, it was clear he saw Hogwarts not as a place of education, but as a stage on which he could perform, dazzle, and feed the myth he'd built around himself. His books, Magical Me, Holidays with Hags, and Travels with Trolls, were less autobiographies than they were extended love letters to his own reflection. So when Dumbledore was removed, Lockhart took it as fate. He interpreted the crisis not as a threat, but as a calling. In his mind, Hogwarts needed saving, and who better than the celebrated author, award-winning smile-holder, and supposed vanquisher of countless dark creatures? He didn't wait for an invitation. He stormed toward the headmaster's office, puffed up with purpose, ready to assume a throne he had not earned. Professor McGonagall, who had taken over Dumbledore's responsibilities in the interim, saw through Lockhart like glass. She had never believed a word of his tales. Neither had Professor Snape, who treated Lockhart's presence with the same disdain he reserved for flobberworms. But Lockhart blinded by self-assurance, genuinely expected them to hand him the keys to the castle. According to the Chamber of Secrets, Rowling writes with biting precision, the moment Dumbledore left, Lockhart had dashed into the staff room, rubbing his hands and suggesting that he was the natural choice to take over. It was not a joke, though it read like one. He genuinely saw himself as the phoenix rising from Dumbledore's metaphorical ashes. This was not simple arrogance, it was delusion on an operatic scale. Lockhart did not merely want to be admired, he wanted to be immortalized. In his mind, stepping into Dumbledore's shoes wasn't just a logical next step, it was destiny. He believed his face should be on the chocolate frog cards, his portrait hanging in the headmaster's office, his legacy engraved alongside the giants of the magical world. What made this moment truly tragic and hilarious was not just Lockhart's boldness, but the fact that he expected others to cheer. He believed Minerva McGonagall, the stern and sharp deputy headmistress, would fall at his feet in gratitude. He thought Severus Snape, cold-eyed and cunning, would bow in deference. Even Professor Sprout and Professor Flitwick were not spared from his assumptions. Rowling captures his vanity perfectly. "I'll be in my office getting ready," Lockhart announced confidently, as if the appointment was already sealed. But no one followed. No one agreed. No one even entertained the notion. The silence that greeted him was a sharper rebuke than words could offer. It is a moment that exposes Lockhart completely, not just as a fraud, but as someone utterly unaware of his own incompetence. He could not see that his spells backfired, that his students did not respect him, that his achievements were plagiarized and stolen. He was living in a world he had built out of lies, and in that moment he believed the lie, most of all, that he could be Dumbledore. The contrast between Lockhart and Dumbledore is thunderous. Where Dumbledore was humble, wise, and quietly powerful, Lockhart was loud, foolish, and deeply insecure. Dumbledore's authority stemmed not from titles, but from trust. He led with calm wisdom, even in chaos. Lockhart, by contrast, sought power not to serve, but to shine. When Harry, Ron, and Hermione heard of Lockhart's self-nomination, their reactions were what any sane person's would be: disbelief, followed by dread. The idea of Lockhart guiding the school through crisis was as absurd as a pixie running the Department of Mysteries. Even among students, Lockhart's reputation was crumbling like a poorly cast memory charm. His eventual downfall came soon after. Tasked with entering the Chamber of Secrets, after months of avoiding danger, he tried to flee. His cowardice burst the bubble he had so carefully constructed, but it was his attempt to erase Harry and Ron's memories that finally sealed his fate. The spell backfired, erasing his own past instead. The man who tried to replace Dumbledore lost the very thing he prized most, his identity. Yet the image of Lockhart trying to install himself in the headmaster's chair remains one of the most telling in the series. It reveals how easily charisma without substance can climb high, and how fragile such illusions are when reality intervenes. He believed in his own greatness so deeply it took magical amnesia to finally stop the lie from growing. Hogwarts never entertained Lockhart's fantasy. The professors knew what he was. Dumbledore had known all along. In fact, his appointment had been less an endorsement than a necessity. No other candidate wanted the cursed Defense Against the Dark Arts position. Lockhart had taken it for the wrong reasons, and Hogwarts paid the price in chaos and confusion. Had Lockhart ever succeeded, had the staff been naive or desperate enough to let him try, Hogwarts might have suffered consequences more disastrous than a basilisk in the pipes. Students would have been misled, danger mishandled, and knowledge buried beneath ego. But this moment matters because it is real, not theoretical. It happened in the books, and it matters because it was left out of the films. In the movies, Lockhart is a comic figure. In the books, he is a cautionary tale. His attempt to replace Dumbledore is not just a joke, it is a warning of what happens when lies wear a human face and demand respect. Even after his memory was wiped and he was placed in St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies, Lockhart still clung to the trappings of fame. He signed autographs for healers. He smiled for non-existent cameras. The ambition that once made him believe he could lead Hogwarts still flickered in his vacant eyes. Gilderoy Lockhart remains one of the most fascinating figures in Rowling's world, precisely because he is so real. He is the embodiment of the imposter, the man who believes applause is proof of competence. His brief, ridiculous campaign to become headmaster shows us how dangerous that illusion can be when left unchecked. It is a moment readers often overlook in the larger narrative, but it deserves more attention. Because in a world filled with dragons, Death Eaters and Horcruxes, it is Lockhart's brand of delusion that often does the most damage. The lie so grand, even the liar believes it. Number 23, Tearful Letters from Admirers. It began, quite strangely, not with fame, but with silence. After the events of the Chamber of Secrets, when Gilderoy Lockhart's wand backfired and shattered his memory, he disappeared from public life like smoke in a winter breeze. The wizarding world, always hungry for gossip, naturally shifted its attention to fresher scandals. And yet in the stillness of the Janus Thicky ward at St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries, something peculiar occurred. Letters, dozens of them, hundreds even. They arrived by owl, by hand, by enchanted envelope. They were scented, tear-stained, looped in elegant cursive, or hurried in trembling script. Some even bore lipstick marks. Lockhart, broken, blank, a former peacock reduced to murmurs and confusion, remained a darling of the masses, particularly of the witches who once idolized him. The books only briefly mention this. In Order of the Phoenix, during a visit to St. Mungo's, readers glimpse a Gilderoy who no longer recalls the tales he once told. "Hello," he beams at Harry and the others, holding up a card and announcing proudly, "Healer Smethwick told me I'm getting better." He is cheerful, vacuous, and unaware of who he was. But what lies hidden in that scene is a detail most skip past. He was surrounded by pictures of himself in various heroic poses, and a pile of letters lay beside his bed. These are not fan letters from the days of his fame. These are new, fresh, penned after the truth was out. Gilderoy Lockhart had built his reputation on stolen glory. He bewitched, memory-charmed, and repackaged other people's heroism as his own. When he was exposed, when it became known that he had erased the memories of real heroes to claim their stories, the expectation was clear: disgrace, abandonment, public ridicule. But instead, Lockhart received sympathy. Witch Weekly might have quietly removed his face from its covers, but its readers never truly let him go. The phenomenon puzzled even the most astute minds in the magical community. What was it about Gilderoy that lingered? Perhaps it was his undeniable charm. Even in hospital robes he remained handsome. His golden curls, though now slightly dishevelled, still glimmered under St. Mungo's sterile light. His smile, albeit vacant, retained its polish. To many witches he wasn't a fraud. He was a fallen star, deserving of compassion. A beautiful man, undone by his own ambition. One particular letter, archived by healer Miriam Strout for its poetic intensity, came from a witch named Lavinia Flint. A retired wand-law historian from Upper Flagley, Lavinia had met Lockhart once during a book signing for Wanderings with Werewolves. She wrote, "Even if your tales were borrowed, Gilderoy, your eyes were your own. They saw something the rest of us missed, that the world needs a hero, whether born or built, and you played the part better than most." She included a pressed Daisy and offered to sit by his bedside daily should he need company. Another letter arrived from a young witch named Darlene Plimsoll, who had grown up reading his books. Her tone was less romantic, but deeply emotional. "You made me believe that bravery was possible. I know now those stories weren't real, but the hope they gave me was." Darlene, who had survived a werewolf attack at 11, credited Lockhart's fictionalized accounts with giving her strength through recovery. "Even if it was a lie, it helped me live," she wrote. The paradox was painful, and yet powerful. Lockhart, even in deceit, had given people something to hold on to. Not all letters were kind, of course. A handful of angry owls brought sharp words and hexed parchment, demanding apologies or restitution. but they were rare. For every bitter complaint, 10 letters arrived with perfume and praise. One which, a Madame Leontina Vole from Dorset, sent weekly care packages of lavender biscuits and hand-knitted scarves, insisting they were to keep his spirits warm, poor dear. Another, a ministry clerk named Belinda Hobday, proposed marriage in her 3rd letter. "If your mind remains a mystery," she wrote, "perhaps love can be the spell that unlocks it." To the healers, this devotion became a logistical problem. The letters were too numerous to handle casually. By the end of Lockhart's 2nd year in the ward, he had an entire drawer reserved for mail. Interns sorted them. Some were displayed above his bed. Others, especially those with musical enchantments or magical pop-ups, were stored elsewhere for safety. But Lockhart, in his broken state, was delighted. "They love me," he would tell anyone who passed by. "They truly love me." He wasn't entirely wrong. There was in the hearts of many witches an aching desire to believe in him still. His fall from grace had not broken the fantasy. Instead, it had deepened it. Gilderoy Lockhart became something new, a tragic figure, a wounded soul. He no longer had the words to charm, but his silence, his vulnerability, did the charming for him. Even Minerva McGonagall, who had once rolled her eyes at his flamboyance, reportedly remarked to Poppy Pomfrey during a staff meeting, "There's something Shakespearean about him now, isn't there? All grandeur lost in fog." Severus Snape, less charitable, is said to have muttered, "A buffoon in brocade is still a buffoon." But not even Snape could deny the peculiar persistence of Lockhart's appeal. Some fans even wrote to Albus Dumbledore demanding he use magic to restore Lockhart's memory. Dumbledore never obliged. He believed the damage, self-inflicted though it was, had perhaps freed Lockhart from the burden of falsehood. "There are many kinds of healing," he once told a curious Rita Skeeter in an unpublished interview. "Some are of the mind, some of the soul. And Gilderoy, for all his faults, is finding peace in a place where he no longer has to pretend." And yet the pretending, in some ways, continued. Gilderoy, no longer bound by truth or fiction, began inventing new tales from the fragments of his fractured memory. To one healer, he confided that he had once slain a lethifold with only a bootlace and a song. To another, he insisted he had dined with the Minister for Magic last week. The delusions were harmless, but they were also familiar. The same stories, recycled with new details, fluttered from his lips like autumn leaves. Visitors loved this. One elderly witch, Agatha Bramble, visited every fortnight just to hear what Jilly would say next. "He may not remember who he is," she told a Daily Prophet columnist, "but he still has better stories than anyone else in this ward." Lockhart's ward became something of a pilgrimage site. Not officially, of course, but witches of a certain age, many dressed in old Witch Weekly fan club robes, came to sit near him, to bring him sweets, to thank him for saving them in ways he never truly had. One brought a scrapbook of headlines, another a dog-eared copy of Magical Me, annotated with hearts and glitter. The irony was bitter. The man who once lived by lies was now adored for being not much at all. But perhaps that was the key. In forgetting himself, Lockhart became a blank page onto which others could project their fantasies, their hopes, their dreams. He was no longer the author of his life, but his fans had picked up the quill. And so the crying letters continued. They came in seasons, in moods, in cycles. Valentine's Day brought a flood of enchanted pink notes. Christmas arrived with handmade jumpers and enchanted snowflakes. Some were sad, deeply so, written by lonely witches who found in Lockhart's smile a light in their own personal darkness. Others were maternal, treating him as a child in need of care. A few were haunting in their adoration, speaking of eternal love for a man who no longer remembered his name. The books never returned to Lockhart's fate in any real depth. His story, sidelined, faded like a footnote. But in the margins, in that hospital room decorated with framed photos of a man who no longer knew himself, the truth lingers. Gilderoy Lockhart, disgraced and broken, was never truly abandoned. He was embraced by a peculiar kind of fame, one more enduring than awards or best-selling charts. because even stripped of his lies, Lockhart remained a symbol. Not of heroism, but of the need for it. People clung to the fantasy he once sold, not because they believed in its reality, but because they needed what it represented. Glamour, courage, beauty, charm. He had been a lighthouse in the storm, even if the light was fake. One night, a healer found him writing. Not well, his script was jagged and confused, but the page bore a single line, written over and over. "They still love me." The healer didn't correct him. Instead, she smiled, adjusted the pillow behind his back, and placed another letter into his hand. Number 24, his attitude toward muggles. Few figures in the Harry Potter universe embody vanity and deception as thoroughly as Gilderoy Lockhart. With his dazzling smile and immaculate robes, Lockhart enchanted the wizarding world with tales of heroic feats and daring adventures. Yet behind the golden hair and best-selling books there existed a troubling pattern of behavior, a consistent undercurrent of disdain for those who didn't fit his ideal of magical excellence, especially Muggleborns. While he never openly proclaimed any hatred for Muggles, a closer examination of his actions and words reveals an implicit prejudice that paints a less flattering portrait of the man so many once adored. From the moment Lockhart burst into the narrative in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, he was defined by superficial charm and relentless self-promotion. His arrival at Hogwarts as the new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher was greeted with adoration by many, especially those enchanted by his glossy book covers. Yet even in his first lesson, Lockhart showed a particular arrogance towards students who didn't immediately express admiration for his works. Hermione Granger, Muggle-born and intellectually gifted, was the only student to answer his questions correctly, not by skill, but because she had read all of his books. To Lockhart, that alone validated her worth. But this validation came not from genuine respect. Lockhart's praise was conditional. He showed little interest in Hermione's magical talents or her curiosity about real defense against the dark arts. Instead, he saw in her a reflection of his own celebrity, someone who had bought into his narrative. Had she questioned his stories or challenged his expertise, as Harry often did, his approval would have vanished. The implication was clear. Those who revered him were worthy of his attention. Those who did not, particularly if they were not of pure magical lineage, were dismissed as ignorant or insignificant. One telling moment came during Lockhart's ill-fated dueling club session. After summoning Professor Snape to demonstrate a simple duel, Lockhart launched into an overblown explanation of his supposed experiences, bragging about subduing dark wizards in unthinkable circumstances. He referred to these supposed adversaries as primitive and uncivilized, revealing a pattern in his storytelling. Many of Lockhart's tales, such as those recounted in Wanderings with Werewolves and Travels with Trolls, involved him saving populations from wild magical creatures or so-called barbaric spellcasters. These stories often took place in remote regions populated by characters who were poorly educated or strangely dressed. Descriptions that resembled colonial tropes more than authentic encounters. The people in his tales were often depicted with subtle yet pointed cues of inferiority. It's no coincidence that in Magical Me, Lockhart proudly described how he had once been honored by a tribe of rainforest wizards who, according to his version, had mistaken him for a sun god. He recounted how they had never seen a wand used properly and were amazed at his magical prowess. The passage read like a caricature, a theatrical exaggeration designed to mock rather than admire. Even though it may have been entirely fabricated, as later revelations about Lockhart's use of memory charms proved, his choice to frame others as ignorant and himself as the enlightened savior shows his internalized sense of superiority. It's a superiority that did not discriminate solely based on magical ability, but often intersected with race, culture, and education. Lockhart's classroom approach further revealed his contempt for those not immediately aligned with his worldview. He dismissed practical teaching in favor of celebrity anecdotes. When Seamus Finnegan, a half-blood student, Asked a legitimate question about counter-curses, Lockhart brushed it off with a superficial comment about not needing books for real bravery. He turned every conversation into a monologue about his own alleged achievements, leaving no space for critical thought or meaningful dialogue. Those who questioned him, like Harry and Ron, were treated with passive aggression. And though Hermione was praised early on, even she eventually became a target of his condescension when her curiosity began to dig beneath the surface. Lockhart's treatment of Colin Creevey was particularly telling. Colin, a Muggle-born first year, idolized Lockhart as much as he idolized Harry, yet Lockhart never once showed genuine interest in Colin as a person. He smiled for Colin's photos, but only because it gave him another opportunity to bask in the spotlight. When Colin was later petrified by the basilisk, Lockhart showed no concern. There was no comment, no reflection. Colin was merely one more name on a list of casualties that inconvenienced Lockhart's self-image. The indifference was chilling. Another moment came when Harry was taken to Professor Lockhart's office after breaking his arm during a Quidditch match. Rather than express concern or try to understand what had happened, Lockhart seized the opportunity to display his skill, insisting on treating Harry himself. The result was disastrous. He removed the bones from Harry's arm entirely. His error was not just incompetence, it was rooted in a dangerous arrogance, the belief that his name and image were more important than learning or precision. When Madame Pomfrey reprimanded him, Lockhart dismissed her with a thin smile, claiming he had nearly done that on purpose. His refusal to take responsibility revealed not only cowardice but a deeper apathy toward the consequences of his actions, especially when those affected were students without powerful, wizarding bloodlines. In private moments, Lockhart's prejudice emerged more plainly. When confronted by Harry and Ron in his office before the final descent into the Chamber of Secrets, he admitted that he had never performed the heroic acts in his books. Instead, he had interviewed real heroes, often witches and wizards from marginalized communities, and then erased their memories to steal their stories. "It's really very simple," he said. "If there's one thing I pride myself on, it's my memory charms." These victims were often from distant countries or isolated magical enclaves, places where their voices were unlikely to be heard again. Lockhart not only silenced them, he erased them entirely. There's a cruelty in Lockhart's chosen targets. He didn't steal the glory of the famous or powerful. He sought out those who had no platform, no connections. His victims included a witch in the Urals who fought off a banshee single-handedly and an old warlock from the mountains of Tibet who had tamed a yeti. These were individuals whose tales would have enriched the magical world, but instead their experiences were used to craft the hollow myth of a man who had done none of it. Lockhart preferred to erase the contributions of others than allow the magical community to admire someone who didn't match his ideal image of heroism. His casual use of memory charms also speaks volumes about how he viewed other people, not as equals, but as tools. He didn't consider the moral weight of wiping someone's identity. In Lockhart's world, magical power wasn't about understanding or community, it was about control. And those without the ability to resist, be they Muggle-born, half-blood, or from obscure magical lineages, were simply collateral in his rise to fame. In contrast to figures like Dumbledore, who valued diversity and treated every magical person with respect regardless of their background, Lockhart's world was one of hierarchy. He saw himself at the top, not through skill or knowledge, but through performance and reputation. Those who hadn't read his books, hadn't cheered for his staged victories, or hadn't understood the importance of his fashion choices were outsiders, either pitiable or irrelevant. This extended not only to Muggles but to squibs and magical creatures as well. He once remarked in an interview reprinted in Witch Weekly that he found house elves charming, in a rustic sort of way, a phrase that barely veiled his discomfort with beings he considered beneath him. One could argue that Lockhart's prejudice wasn't ideological, but personal, that he didn't hate Muggles or Muggle-borns per se, but simply loved himself too much to care about anyone else. But such narcissism inevitably leads to exclusion. His lack of empathy, his reliance on stereotypes, and his eagerness to mock the unfamiliar all built a worldview that left no room for those who didn't serve his ego. In doing so, Lockhart contributed to the very prejudices that plagued the wizarding world, even if he didn't wave the banner of blood purity like the Malfoys. It is telling that the films softened this portrayal. Kenneth Branagh's charming performance emphasized Lockhart's vanity and incompetence, but rarely his deeper flaws. In the movies, Lockhart is comic relief, bumbling, clueless, but ultimately harmless. The books tell a darker story. Lockhart is not simply a fool, he is a man who willingly destroyed others to preserve an illusion. And in choosing his victims from the fringes of the magical world, he perpetuated a system that rewarded glamour and punished authenticity. Lockhart's downfall, being struck by his own memory charm, was poetic. It wasn't simply a punishment for lying, it was justice for silencing voices that mattered. The wizarding world lost not just a fraud, but 1,000 untold stories that might have changed how witches and wizards viewed their own history. In the end, Lockhart became a hollow man in a hospital bed, his smile still intact, but his mind a blank slate. A fitting fate for someone who built his empire on erasing others. Today, when readers revisit the Harry Potter series, they often laugh at Lockhart's arrogance or shake their heads at his vanity. But beneath the surface lies a more unsettling truth. Gilderoy Lockhart was not just a fraud, he was a reflection of how easily the wizarding world could be seduced by surface over substance. And in his treatment of muggles and muggle-borns, in his casual disregard for those without power or status, he left a legacy far more troubling than the books he faked. His smile may have lit up covers, but his heart remained a shadow behind the gloss. Number 25. How he became famous. At first glance, Gilderoy Lockhart's golden smile, cascading blonde curls, and impeccable taste in robes give the impression of a man who was destined for greatness. The wizarding world came to know him as an adventurer, a scholar of the arcane, a defender against the darkest forces that haunt its fringes. His book covers were adorned with images of dragons recoiling at his glare and banshees fleeing at his footsteps. To the everyday witch or wizard browsing Flourish and Blots, he was a paragon of magical heroism. But as with many things in the wizarding world, appearances were deceiving. The story of Lockhart's fame is not one of courage but of cunning. Born to a muggle father and a witch mother, Gilderoy was the only magical child among his siblings. From early on, he showed signs not of brilliance in magic, but of relentless vanity. As a student at Hogwarts, he was sorted into Ravenclaw, a house famed for intellect and wit. Yet Lockhart's school performance was mediocre at best. In Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, Professor McGonagall herself remarked that he was not the most promising student. He earned no academic honours, struggled with even the simplest charms, and once attempted to etch his signature into the Quidditch pitch using enchanted fireworks, a project that went spectacularly wrong and scorched a quarter of the lawn. Despite his unimpressive abilities, Lockhart craved attention. In his 5th year, he submitted weekly letters to the Daily Prophet, detailing fictitious discoveries of rare magical plants that he had supposedly cultivated in the Forbidden Forest. None were published. He once faked a sighting of the crumple-horned snorkack just to get mentioned in the Quibbler, and when that failed, he started a rumour that he was part Veela. Even when caught lying, Lockhart never wavered. He had already developed a belief that being perceived as extraordinary was more important than actually being extraordinary. But Lockhart's true transformation began after Hogwarts. Armed with a wand he barely knew how to wield and a suitcase full of blank journals, he set out into the world, not to seek heroism, but to find those who had already earned it. It was in Eastern Europe, nestled in a snow-covered village near the Carpathian Mountains, that he first encountered Olga Grunion, a quiet witch who had single-handedly saved her village from a vampire infestation. Lockhart listened to her story with rapt attention, nodding as she described the ambush she had set in the forest, the runes she had carved, the rituals she had memorized. When she finished, he asked for a photograph, then promptly erased her memory with a perfectly executed memory charm. This was Lockhart's true talent, not bravery nor magical strength, but the precise application of Obliviate. He had practiced it so obsessively in school that by the time he graduated, he could target and remove specific memories with surgical accuracy. From that moment on, he found others like older wizards, witches, even magical creatures who had accomplished great things. He interviewed them under the guise of writing their biographies. He took their stories, their achievements, and their very identities. And then he took their memories. Each theft made him bolder. He travelled through the Alps where he found a young Romanian witch named Anca Petrescu who had tracked and bound an Erkling that was terrorizing the mountain villages. He listened to her, nodded solemnly, and told her the world needed to hear her tale. By the time the sun rose the next day, Anca remembered only a stranger with a friendly voice and a warm smile. Lockhart remembered everything. In his book, Year with the Yeti, the adventure is told as his own. I wrestled the creature to the snow and outwitted its bloodlust with a cleverly cast charm of silence, he wrote. Not a word of it was true. The wizarding public had no reason to doubt him. His books were vibrant, his stories compelling, his charisma overwhelming. Lockhart wasn't merely a fraud, he was a performer. He gave readings of his adventures at bookstores and wizarding academies, charming crowds with exaggerated retellings of encounters he had never lived. In Wandering with Werewolves, he claimed to have fought off a pack in the Black Forest with nothing but his silver-plated comb. In Travels with Trolls, he boasted of surviving a 3-day standoff in a Swedish cave using nothing but guile, garlic, and a touch of glamour. No one asked why he bore no scars. No one questioned why no one else seemed to know of these beasts. He had mastered the art of storytelling, and with it, the art of deception. Even his fellow authors began to suspect something was amiss. Mirabella Plunkett, a respected magi zoologist, once wrote a letter to the Daily Prophet questioning the inconsistencies in Lockhart's accounts. "A man who claims to have fought both a manticore and a lethifold," she wrote, "would, at the very least, carry some magical residue. Gilderoy Lockhart smells only of expensive cologne." Her accusations were ignored. The public had already chosen their darling. Lockhart's most audacious act came just 2 years before he accepted the position at Hogwarts. In the desolate wilds of Australia, he found a pair of elderly wizards, Marcus and Elaine Thistlewood, who had survived an encounter with a nest of lethifolds. They described it with trembling hands and haunted eyes, speaking of a night cloaked in darkness and voices that vanished into the wind. Lockhart listened, took notes, and nodded. The next morning, their memories were gone. The Thistlewoods would live out their remaining years telling neighbours of strange dreams they couldn't explain. Lockhart returned to Britain and wrote Break with a Banshee, which became an instant bestseller. It was only when he accepted the Defence Against the Dark Arts position at Hogwarts that his carefully built illusion began to crumble. He had spent years in the spotlight, but never in a classroom. Teaching required something he didn't possess, actual knowledge. His lessons were disastrous. Students quickly realized he couldn't perform the spells he wrote about. In one class, he attempted to demonstrate the homorphous charm on a group of pixies and was promptly chased out of the room. Professor Snape, never one to hide contempt, described him as a celebrity masquerading as a scholar. The truth came crashing down during the events of Chamber of Secrets, when Lockhart attempted to flee from danger rather than face it. When confronted by Harry and Ron, he confessed without shame, "Books can be misleading." Then he raised his wand to erase their memories as he had done countless times before, but this time the spell backfired. His own wand, damaged earlier, turned the memory charm on its caster. In an instant, Lockhart forgot everything, his name, his fame, and his lies. Ironically, the very magic that had elevated him to greatness became the instrument of his fall. St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies now housed a man who still wore bright robes and practiced autographing anything handed to him, but who couldn't remember why he was famous. "Am I someone important?" he once asked a healer, a sad echo of the boy who once longed for his name to be known across the wizarding world. What makes Lockhart's story so tragic and so fascinating is how closely it mirrors the dangers of vanity unchecked. Unlike Voldemort, who pursued power for domination, Lockhart pursued fame for its own sake. He didn't seek to control others, only to be adored by them, and in his quest for recognition, he destroyed the memories, and in many ways the lives, of those who had truly earned the praise. Rowling's books hint at this complexity. In Chamber of Secrets, Dumbledore does not scold Lockhart with anger, but with weary pity. "Fame is a fickle friend, Harry," he tells Harry later, a line that resonates deeper when one knows what Lockhart had done. His story serves as a chilling warning to those who place image over substance, and a reminder that true greatness is not something you can steal. It is something you must earn. To this day, many in the wizarding world still display Lockhart's books on their shelves, some out of nostalgia, others in irony. And perhaps the cruelest twist of all is that despite the truth being known, Gilderoy Lockhart remains a household name, not because of his real deeds, but because of the stories he told. And maybe, deep down, that's all he ever wanted. Number 26, Lockhart and Neville Longbottom. Of all the flamboyant figures to ever teach at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, few were as dazzling and as hollow as Gilderoy Lockhart. Cloaked in peacock blue robes and armed with an ego as large as the Forbidden Forest, Lockhart strutted into the defense against the dark arts position during Harry Potter's second year. Much of what the films offer is his absurd self-admiration and his fumbling incompetence. Yet they neglect one subtle, deeply human side of his teaching: the quiet devastation he inflicted on students who were already struggling, none more so than Neville Longbottom. In J.K. Rowling's Chamber of Secrets, there is a particularly haunting moment, buried among the lighter tales of Cornish pixies and dueling clubs, that reveals the true cost of Lockhart's presence at Hogwarts. During a classroom session, Lockhart fails to notice or care that not every student learns the same way, not every wand moves with confidence, not every child feels comfortable in their own skin. Neville, ever the hesitant and humble boy, becomes an unfortunate victim of Lockhart's vanity. The scene occurs when students are practicing the forgetfulness charm, a spell Lockhart claims to have used on a mad Transylvanian witch in his book Wanderings with Werewolves. In the lesson, Neville struggles, as he often does, and his wand work lacks the flair that Lockhart so prides himself on. Instead of guiding him or offering encouragement, Lockhart singles him out in front of the entire class. With a theatrical sigh, he proclaims, "Tut, tut, hardly worth my time to show a spell if the class can't be bothered to practice properly. Only the extremely lazy fail at such a basic charm." The word lazy stung more than any spell ever could. For anyone familiar with Neville's backstory, the tragic fate of his parents, his constant fear of inadequacy, his desperate need to prove himself, this insult was not merely misguided, it was cruel. Neville was not lazy, he was haunted. Every spell he attempted carried the weight of expectation, both from others and from himself. Lockhart's insult worked like poison. Laughter rippled through the classroom, and Neville's ears turned a shade of crimson. He ducked his head and focused intently on his wand, as if willing it to disappear. Hermione Granger shot Lockhart a disapproving glance, and even Ron Weasley looked uncomfortable. But Lockhart noticed none of it, or worse, he didn't care. He was too busy adjusting his hair in a nearby mirror. In that moment, Lockhart revealed the truth of his character. Not only was he a fraud in his career, but also in his role as a teacher. The mark of a true educator is not the ability to dazzle a crowd, it's the capacity to lift the weakest students. Lockhart did the opposite. He tore down those who needed support, and he did it with a smile. Neville, already on shaky ground with magic, retreated further into himself after that class. His confidence, which had only recently begun to flicker to life, dimmed once more. The damage done by Lockhart wasn't as visible as a hex or a jinx, but it was real. It was the type of wound that festers in silence, the kind that tells a child they're not good enough, that they'll never be enough. This is what the films failed to capture. While they present Lockhart as comedic relief, Rowling's text paints a more nuanced picture. Lockhart is not simply laughable, he is dangerous, not because he casts dark spells, but because he wounds with words, words that leave lasting scars on the minds of young, vulnerable students. In a later scene, Professor Snape, no stranger to harshness himself, shows more restraint and awareness than Lockhart ever does. Snape, for all his cruelty, sees potential in Neville, even if it's buried under layers of fear. Lockhart, on the other hand, sees nothing but his own reflection. And in that reflection he finds no room for the struggles of boys like Neville. Even Dumbledore, in his subtle wisdom, seems to recognize Lockhart's failings. While he does not intervene directly, perhaps due to his penchant for letting students learn through experience, his eyes always seem to be watching. It is no coincidence that Lockhart's tenure ends in disgrace, his memory wiped by his own backfiring spell. A poetic justice for a man who never took the time to truly know his students. For Neville, the year with Lockhart was one more stone in a heavy bag he carried throughout his early years at Hogwarts. And yet, perhaps it was also a turning point, because sometimes being belittled forces a soul to fight harder, to prove wrong every voice that ever called them weak or lazy or unworthy. And Neville did exactly that. Years later, in the Battle of Hogwarts, Neville Longbottom stood tall with the sword of Gryffindor in hand, slashing through the final Horcrux, cutting down Nagini, and helping to end Voldemort's reign of terror. The boy who once trembled before a classroom now roared in the face of death. He did not do it because of Lockhart, but despite him. Lockhart, for his part, faded into obscurity. Confined to St. Mungo's hospital for magical maladies, his memory gone, he signed photographs for visitors he didn't remember. A tragic end, perhaps, but a fitting one for a man who built his legacy on the achievements of others and ignored the needs of those entrusted to him. And what of the students who suffered under him? Most, like Hermione, moved on. Others, like Harry, came to understand the deeper complexities of heroism and fraudulence, but for Neville, Lockhart represented something far more personal, a teacher who failed him when he needed lifting up the most. What the scene with Neville tells us is not just that Lockhart was incompetent, but that his failure was rooted in something more sinister, a complete lack of empathy. He could not see past his own reflection, and in doing so he trampled on the very children he was supposed to guide. Neville's journey, however, is a testament to resilience. He could have crumbled. He could have let Lockhart's words define him. But, instead, he slowly, quietly, built himself up. Not with grand gestures, but with steady progress, a well-brewed potion in herbology, a correctly cast charm in DA practice, a firm step taken each time he returned to the room of requirement. By the time he held the sword, he no longer needed validation, not from Lockhart, not from Snape, not even from his friends. He had found it within himself. Therein lies the beauty and the tragedy of that single moment in Lockhart's class. It is easy to miss in a sea of magical mishaps and classroom chaos, but it marks the subtle beginning of a greater transformation, not in Lockhart, who remains stagnant and shallow, but in Neville, who slowly forges himself into a hero. The books show us that magic is not always in wands or words. Sometimes it lies in how a person endures, in how they respond to cruelty with courage. Neville's resilience is magic of the highest order, and Lockhart, for all his boasts, never possessed that kind. This contrast, so clear on the page, becomes a lost opportunity on the screen. The films, while delightful in many ways, reduce Lockhart to comic relief. They miss the quiet tragedy of a student humiliated. They gloss over the small, sharp injustices that build the character of a future warrior. Had the film included this moment, perhaps audiences would have seen more clearly the impact teachers can have, for better or worse. Lockhart could have remained a fool, but also a cautionary tale. And Neville? He would still have been the quiet boy with trembling hands, but we would have watched those hands steady themselves, spell by spell, until they wielded a sword with unwavering resolve. Lockhart is remembered in the wizarding world for his books and his vanity, But in the hearts of students like Neville, he is remembered for something else entirely, as a symbol of how not to teach, how not to lead, and how not to treat those who are already burdened. And that is a lesson far more powerful than any charm he ever faked. Number 27. Fear of being found out. Of all the glittering facades in the wizarding world, none shimmered quite as blindingly as that of Gilderoy Lockhart. With his flowing golden hair, dazzling smile, and shelves stacked with books penned under his own name, he was the embodiment of success, or so he wanted everyone to believe. But beneath the peacock-blue robes and theatrical gestures, there trembled a man gripped by an all-consuming fear, the fear of being found out. Lockhart was not merely an egotist. He was not merely vain. He was a fraud, and every hour of his life was a desperate performance to keep the truth buried. The films captured the vanity, the empty bragging, the hollow charm, but they never dove into the marrow-deep terror that drove Lockhart's every move. J.K. Rowling's books, however, paint a different picture. Lockhart's real character emerges in scattered moments, gestures, hesitations, nervous glances that hint at something darker than arrogance. In the book Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, Lockhart is not just comic relief. He is a man crumbling under the weight of a lie he cannot maintain much longer. From the first day of term at Hogwarts, Lockhart launched a campaign of self-promotion that bordered on mania. His office walls were plastered with portraits of himself posing heroically. He staged signing events for his books, posed endlessly, and seemed far more interested in his own legend than in teaching defense against the dark arts. But every theatrical act was a diversion. He needed people to look, but only where he pointed. He was a magician not in spell work, but in misdirection. Every detail of Lockhart's persona was curated for illusion. His robes were always bright and expensive. His hair was always perfectly styled. He smiled too often, spoke too loudly, and constantly shifted the subject to himself. This wasn't just narcissism. It was panic control. He feared silence. He feared scrutiny. He feared that if he stopped talking, someone might ask the wrong question. Someone might notice that the hero of the Gadley Gauntlet didn't know how to perform a basic shield charm. When Hermione Granger asked him a technical question in class, he deflected with charm. When a student brought up an inconsistency in one of his books, he laughed and waved it off as a printing error. These were not mere accidents. They were instinctive, rehearsed moves in the delicate dance of deception. "Fame is a fickle friend, Harry," Lockhart said once with dramatic solemnity. But what he truly feared wasn't the loss of fame. It was exposure. Lockhart's true method of acquiring fame was darker than anyone suspected. He sought out witches and wizards who had survived great dangers, listened to their stories, and then, after modifying their memories with the Obliviate charm, claimed the feats as his own. In his own words, the trick is to be quick with the wand, take a good long memory to build from, and polish the story with just enough drama. These weren't victims of flattery, they were victims of theft, of their heroism, their voices, their truth. But perhaps the most damning evidence of Lockhart's fear comes at the story's climax. When Harry and Ron confront him in his office, demanding he come with them into the Chamber of Secrets to save Ginny Weasley, Lockhart's mask finally breaks. "Boys," he says, his voice faltering. He tries to keep up the act, but his hands tremble, his smile becomes forced, and then, as if snapping under years of pressure, he confesses, not out of remorse, but because he believes he can now escape. He picks up his wand to erase their memories. It is not bravery that drives him, it is survival. The moment he is backed into a corner, his true self is revealed in full. A coward, yes, but more than that, a man absolutely undone by the fear of being ordinary. Lockhart never feared monsters or death. He feared mediocrity. He feared that behind the smiles and accolades, he was no one at all. He clung to false stories because he had none of his own. Even his attempt to erase Harry and Ron's memories was not an act of aggression, but one of desperation. If they remembered, everything would collapse. All the awards, the book deals, the portraits, gone. The magical community would turn on him, laugh at him, forget him, and for Lockhart, that was the ultimate horror. "You mean you're running away?" asked Harry, "after all that stuff you did in your books?" But Lockhart only smiled weakly and admitted, "Books can be misleading." It was the most honest thing he ever said. Lockhart's entire presence at Hogwarts had been built on fear. He had accepted the teaching post not because he cared about students or defense against the dark arts, but because it was another stage, another spotlight. He thought he could coast through the year with charm alone, but the reality of the position, the threats, the responsibility, the scrutiny was too much. With each new attack at the school, he became more nervous, more erratic. He began faking sickness, disappearing during emergencies, pretending to be helpful while actually doing nothing. He prayed the situation would resolve itself so he could take credit without risk. When Professor McGonagall asked all the teachers to help patrol the halls, Lockhart excused himself with vague promises about needing to prepare a counter-curse. When students began suspecting Harry, Lockhart leapt on the opportunity to act superior, but avoided real confrontation. He was a man grasping for control in a situation that constantly reminded him of his own inadequacy. The Chamber of Secrets was not just a danger to Hogwarts, it was a threat to his entire charade. Ironically, it was his obsession with image that made his fall so spectacular. If he had been humbler, quieter, less conspicuous, perhaps no one would have questioned his failures. But Lockhart had made himself too visible. He had declared himself the expert on dark creatures. He had mocked other professors. He had promised too much. When the moment came to prove himself, he had nothing. In that final moment, standing in front of the sink that led to the chamber, wand in hand, his voice shaking, he knew the performance was over. And so he did the only thing he knew. He tried to erase the witnesses. It failed. The wand he grabbed was Ron's, broken and splintered. The Obliviate charm backfired spectacularly, and the irony could not have been sharper. Lockhart lost the very thing he had used to destroy others. He lost his own memory. In the aftermath, he didn't even remember who he was. The man who had spent his life terrified of being revealed had finally been emptied of all identity. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, when Harry visits St. Mungo's hospital, he sees Lockhart again. There are no bright robes, no dazzling smiles. Lockhart is childlike, cheerful in a vacant way, signing autographs he doesn't understand. He still thinks he's famous, the healer says kindly, and in a strange way it is mercy. Lockhart's mind is gone, but so too is his fear. For the first time in his life, he is free from the crushing pressure of keeping up the lie. What Rowling captures so brilliantly in Lockhart is not just cowardice, but the psychological cost of self-deception. He is a warning about what happens when we build our worth on illusions. Every smile, every compliment he forced out of the world was another brick in the wall that kept him prisoner. His fear of being ordinary, of being forgotten, drove him to commit crimes that stole not only truth, but dignity from others and, ultimately, from himself. Lockhart's story is not tragic in the classical sense. There is no grand fall from nobility, but it is tragic in its smallness, in its banality. He could have been someone. He had charisma, presence, wit. But instead of working, learning, becoming, he stole. Because he feared being seen without the shine. He feared being called what he was, just another wizard with average skill and above-average vanity. In many ways, Lockhart is the dark mirror of Harry. Both are thrust into fame, both have attention they did not entirely seek. But Harry constantly resists the pedestal, while Lockhart clings to it. Harry wants to be known for who he really is, even when it's painful. Lockhart wants to be known only for what he pretends to be. One grows by facing the truth, the other is destroyed by hiding from it. In the end, Gilderoy Lockhart serves as more than comic relief. He is a character study in insecurity, in the desperation to matter. His fear is not just of being discovered, it is the fear of being invisible without the illusion. That is why he talks so much. That is why he surrounds himself with mirrors and portraits. because silence and reflection are his enemies. In silence there are questions, in reflection there is truth, and so he dances constantly nervously around the truth until finally it catches up. And when it does, he cannot run fast enough. The wand fails, the memory shatters, and Lockhart, once a master of rewriting others' stories, is left without even his own. Number 28. Knew nothing about the dark arts. The most ironic detail in the entire saga of Gilderoy Lockhart is not that he was vain, nor that he was a fraud, nor even that he stole the glory of others. It is the cruel absurdity that he held the most critical post at Hogwarts, Professor of Defense against the Dark Art. While knowing absolutely nothing about the dark arts at all, he was not just unqualified, he was dangerous, and the greatest trick he ever pulled was convincing the magical world that he was a master of a subject he didn't understand in the slightest. His appointment to the post was the result of desperation on the part of Albus Dumbledore. After the curse placed upon the position by Tom Riddle, no defense against the dark arts teacher had lasted more than a year. Dumbledore, in a moment of uncharacteristic miscalculation, allowed Lockhart to fill the vacancy. On paper, Lockhart looked ideal. He had published Magical Me, Gadding with Ghouls, and Voyages with Vampires. He had a smile that gleamed like a polished snitch and a signature that filled entire scrolls with loops and flourishes. But all of this was a smokescreen. From the very first class, Lockhart's incompetence was impossible to ignore. His lesson plans were not based on real magical education, but on theatrical reenactments of fictionalized events. In his debut lesson, he released a cage of Cornish pixies, a minor nuisance at best, and watched, completely helpless, as chaos unfolded. When Seamus Finnegan dangled upside down from a chandelier and Neville Longbottom was flung across the room, Lockhart simply stood there, clutching his wand like a man holding a sword by the blade. He muttered an incantation that had no effect. Pesci pixi pesta nomi, a spell he had clearly invented on the spot, without any grounding in magical theory. The pixies ignored him entirely. He fled the room moments later, leaving Hermione Granger, a second-year student, to resolve the crisis. This was not a one-time blunder. The following weeks painted an increasingly grim picture. Lockhart's quizzes contained no actual academic content. Instead, they asked questions like, what is Gilderoy Lockhart's favorite color? Or, what is his secret ambition? Answers, lilac and to rid the world of evil and sell his own line of hair care potions. Not a single question pertained to jinxes, counter-curses, or defensive spells. The students were being educated in celebrity worship, not magical survival. His ignorance extended beyond mere spell work. He was unable to explain even the most basic magical principles. When Dean Thomas asked about the effectiveness of the impediment jinx against a boggart, Lockhart launched into an incoherent story about defeating a banshee in Wagga Wagga, a tale that had already been revealed much later to have been someone else's achievement entirely. Lockhart's answer not only failed to address the question, but actively confused the students. His lessons were not merely useless, they were misleading. As months passed, more cracks appeared. In Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, J.K. Rowling writes, the rest of the class was very glad when Lockhart announced that they should start working in pairs to practice the counter-curse he had just demonstrated. None of them had understood what it was supposed to do, much less how to perform it. That line encapsulates Lockhart's pedagogy. He performed meaningless wand movements, recited gibberish, and called it education. But the clearest indicator of Lockhart's incompetence was his reaction to real danger. When students were attacked and the whispers of the heir of Slytherin began to spread, Lockhart strutted around the castle, offering useless reassurances. He claimed that he could track the creature through its lair, that he knew secret spells to ward off serpents. But when it came time to act, he was paralyzed. In one unforgettable moment, Professor McGonagall dryly informs him that it is time for him to do what he has boasted about for months, descend into the Chamber of Secrets and save the school. His response? Terror, thinly veiled with an awkward laugh. He was caught in his own lie, yet his greatest moment of disgrace was still to come, when Harry and Ron forced Lockhart to accompany them into the chamber, a task he tried to weasel out of repeatedly. He made one last attempt to regain control. He stole Ron's broken wand and attempted to obliviate the boys, but in his ignorance he failed to realize that the wand was faulty. The spell backfired, a loud bang echoed in the tunnel, and Lockhart was thrown backward with such force that part of the ceiling collapsed. More importantly, his memory was obliterated. In poetic justice, the very magic he had used to destroy others' stories finally turned on him. The irony is so sharp it cuts. Lockhart's fame had been built on memory charms, powerful Obliviate spells that he used to erase the true heroes of his books. An unnamed witch who had actually defeated the Wagga Wagga Banshee. An old warlock who had survived a horde of yetis. A wizard from Transylvania who had outwitted a coven of vampires. Lockhart interviewed them, stole their stories, cast Obliviate, and left them broken. In Chamber of Secrets, he casually admits this. The trick is to be prepared. I always have a memory charm ready. Took a full month to get rid of the last one's memory. Poor fellow never knew what hit him. It is this chilling confession that reveals the true nature of Lockhart's fraud. He was not simply a braggart with poor teaching skills. He was a magical criminal who rose to prominence by erasing others and claiming their legends as his own. The classroom was only the latest stage for his performance, a role he was no more prepared to play than he was to face a real dark creature. And yet what may be most damning is that even first-year students could see through the illusion. Hermione Granger, whose intellect is rarely wrong, initially idolized Lockhart, but after a few weeks of watching him fumble spells and blunder through theoretical discussions, she distanced herself. Ron Weasley openly called him a great big fraud, and Harry, who knew danger better than anyone his age, recognized instantly that Lockhart was not a man to be trusted. When children can detect your deception, your disguise is paper thin. Lockhart's case also reveals something darker about the wizarding world's susceptibility to fame. He had the looks, the charm, and the best-selling books, but not one qualification, not one verified act of heroism, no certifications, no ministry records, no credible witnesses, and yet he was invited to Hogwarts, applauded in bookstores, and showered with fan letters. In Magical Me, Lockhart writes, I don't believe in modesty. Modesty's a waste of time. That arrogance, unchecked, allowed him to rise far beyond his abilities, and nearly cost children their lives. Even his own magic was sloppy. He could barely perform a proper disarming charm. His wand work was flashy but without substance. Like a stage magician relying on smoke and mirrors, he dazzled with performance but lacked substance. During the dueling club demonstration, he foolishly challenged Severus Snape, perhaps the most skilled duelist on staff. Snape didn't even try. With a flick of his wand and a single word, Expelliarmus, Lockhart was sent flying, landing in a heap. Laughter rippled through the students. The spell had been simple. The outcome? Inevitable. The tragedy of Lockhart is that he could have been someone useful. He had a genuine talent, memory charms, which under ethical circumstances might have served as a powerful tool in law enforcement or even healing. But his hubris consumed him. Instead of training, he schemed. Instead of learning, he stole. And so he ended up broken, a living ghost in the Janus Thickey ward at St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries, where he signs autographs for visitors without understanding who he is or why they come. There's a sadness in that. Beneath all the arrogance, perhaps there was a boy who once dreamed of being brave, who wanted to be a hero. But he chose the shortcut. He chased glory without labor, fame without sacrifice, knowledge without study. The very subject he pretended to teach, defense against the dark arts, is a discipline that demands rigor, humility, and courage. Lockhart possessed none of these. He taught nothing because he had learned nothing. In the end, Lockhart's story stands as a cautionary tale in the magical world. It warns us of the power of illusion, the dangers of charisma, and the seduction of fame. More than anything, it reminds us that there is no substitute for truth and no shortcut to wisdom.